Dove Audio presents The Girl Who Heard Dragons, 3 short stories by McCaffrey. Aramina was roused by the urgency of her parents' voices, Dowell's a fierce whisper of persuasion, and her mother's a fearful rejoinder. She lay still at first, thinking that her mother had had another of her seeings, but on such occasions Barla's voice was totally devoid of emotion. Straining her ears to pick up only her parents' words, Aramina ignored the myriad nocturnal noises of the enormous Eigen cavern that sheltered some of the hundreds of holdless folk on Pern. "It is pointless to assign blame at this juncture, Barla," her father was whispering, "or to moan about our pride in Aramina's ability. We must leave. Now. Tonight." "But winter comes," Barla wailed. "How will we survive?" "I can't say that we survived all that well here last winter, with so many to share out what game was caught," Dowell said as he rapidly stuffed oddments into the capacious pack. "I've heard tell of caves in Lamos, and Lamos has wood." There was bitterness in Barla's voice. "And none in Eigen to suit you. We may be holdless, woman, but we have not lost honor and dignity. I will not be party to Lady Holdless Tella's designs. I will not permit our daughter to be exploited in such a way. Gather your things. Now, I'll wake the children." When Dowell touched Aramina's shoulder, she swallowed against her fear. She hadn't liked the self-styled Lady Holdless Tella when Tella had sought her out on the last few visits to the Eigen caverns to recruit people to her roving bands. Aramina had been fascinated and obliquely repelled by Giron, Tella's second-in-command, the dragonless man who had scrutinized her so intently that Aramina had been hard put not to squirm under his cold and empty eyes. A man who had been a Dragonrider and lost his dragon was only half a man, or so everyone said. Tella had hinted at concessions for Aramina's family, perhaps even a hold, though Aramina was not so stupid as to contest that possibility, even as Tella offered the bait. Nor did Tella's argument that the holdless had to band together, sharing whatever possessions they had, hold any weight with a child who had early learned that no gift was free. "I'm sorry, Father," she murmured in fearful contrition. "Sorry? For what, child?" "Oh, you heard. You are not at fault, Mina. Can you manage your sister? We must leave now." Aramina nodded. She rose and deftly twisted her blanket about her shoulders to make a sling for Nexa. She had carried her thus often as the small family had wandered eastward. Indeed, Nexa merely draped herself sleepily across Aramina's bony young shoulder and snuggled into the supporting blanket without rousing from her deep slumber. Aramina glanced about, unconsciously checking to see that every one of their few belongings had been reclaimed. "I've already packed the wagon with what we could take," Dowell said. "And Mother thought that thieving Nerat family was pilfering things again." Aramina was somewhat exasperated because she had been obliged to spend in the entire day surreptitiously near that noisome camp, trying to spot any of their belongings. Barla had already gathered up her precious cooking pots, wrapping them in old clothes to prevent their banging. Another shawl held the rest of the family's portables, zealously guarded against the pilfering habits of the cavern's population. "Hush now. Come. We must make the most of the full moons." For the first time, Aramina regretted that her father's skill with woods had purchased for his family a partially secluded alcove toward the rear of the great Eigen cavern. It had been much cooler during the blazing Eigen summer, warmer and sheltered from the bitter winter winds. But now it seemed an interminable distance as they wended a cautious path among sleeping bodies to reach the entrance of the wind-sculpted sandstone cave. Frequently, Aramina had to shift Nexa in the journey down the sands to the river, sinking occasionally into old refuse holes and trying not to trip over debris. Having no hold to be proud of, the holdless residing in Eigen cavern had no pride of place either, and any accommodation, transient or semi-permanent, was marked by mute evidence of their occupancy. The moons came out, bright Bellier high, and the smaller, dimmer Timor halfway down her arc, highlighting Eigen River. Aramina wondered how long her father had planned this exodus, for not only did they have illumination, but the river, dried by the summer's sun, was low enough to make crossing to the Lemos side relatively easy and safe. Very soon, when the fall rains began in the high mountains, no one would be able to cross the torrent that rampaged around the bend, flooding the now shallow ford. Aramina also remembered that Tella and Giron had been in the cavern that very afternoon, unlikely to return for several days, thus giving the fleeing family some margin of escape. Neither had approached Aramina, for which she had been grateful, but perhaps Tella had alarmed Dowell. Whatever the reason, Aramina was grateful on many counts to be away from the brawling, odorous, overcrowded cavern, and she knew that Barla would be too. Her brother Pell's tendency to brag about his family would now be limited to hill and forest, wary and tunnel snake. The dray beasts were already hitched to the family's wagon, a smallish one but adequate for 4 people. Since Aramina heard dragons and could give warning of the imminence of threadfall, the family could travel with some impunity. It was this talent, until just recently considered the family's most valuable asset, that the Lady Holdless Tella wished to pervert to her unlawful ends. Aramina shifted her sleeping sister once more, for both shoulders ached, and Nexa, like other inanimate objects, appeared to grow heavier. Pell had awakened, his initial outburst muffled by Dowell's large hand. He now trotted beside his father, burdened by the shawl bundle, and complained in a low undertone. Aramina came abreast of him. "If you hadn't blabbed to show off, we wouldn't be running away," she said to him in a tone for his ears only. "We aren't running," Pell snapped back, grunting as the shawl bundle cracked him on the right shin. "We don't run away. We change camps." He was taunting her now with her own words used on previous occasions to ease the stigma of their holdlessness. "But where can we go?" And his voice became a frightened wail. "That Tella can't find us." "It's me she wants, and she won't find me. You'll be safe." "I don't want to be safe," Pell replied stoutly, "if you have to run because of me and my big mouth." "Hush," said Dowell in a sharp voice. The children trudged the rest of the way in silence. Their dray beasts, Nudge and Shove, turned their heads, lowing softly at the approach of familiar people. Dowell had left them with sufficient grain in their feed bags to content them. Barla climbed into the rear of the hide-covered wagon, took the sleeping Nexa from Aramina, the bundle from Pell, and gestured the children to the fore where Dowell was untying ring reins from the tetherstone. Aramina and Pell reclaimed their goods from the wagon and took their positions, one on either side of the team, ready to encourage them into the river and up the bank on the far side. Dowell and Barla would walk behind to push should the wagon founder. Despite the hour and the circumstances of their departure, Aramina felt a tremendous relief as they moved off. 2 turns ago, she had been inexpressibly relieved not to have to plod at the pace of Nudge and Shove day after weary day. But now traveling was a far more palatable alternative to being part of Tella's vindictive schemes. "We are not holdless by choice, Aramina," Barla had often abjured her daughter, "for your father held well under Lord Cale of Ruata Hold." "Oh!" and Barla would bow her head and press her hands to her mouth in anguish over terrible memories. The perfidy, the treachery of that terrible, ruthless man, to murder all Ruata blood in one pitiless hour. Barla would gather herself then, lifting her head proudly. "Nor would your father serve Lord Fax of the High Reaches." Barla was not an extravagant person in word or deed, retaining a quiet and unobtrusive dignity, despite all the slights and pettiness that came the way of the holdless. Her acrimony was therefore the more memorable, and Aramina, as well as her surviving brother and sister, knew Fax as the villain, despoiler, and tyrant, possessed of no single redeeming virtue. We had pride enough to leave when he made his unspeakable order. Barla would often color and then pale when reciting this part of their exodus. "Your father had made this very wagon for us to attend gathers." Barla would sigh. "Attend gathers as respected holders, not as wanderers, holdless and friendless. For other lord holders did not wish to antagonize Fax just then, and though your father had been so certain of a welcome elsewhere, there was none. But we are not like the others' children. We chose to retain our honor, and would not submit to the incarnate evil of Fax. Although Barla would never be specific about that, of late Aramina was beginning to get glimmerings, now that she had become a woman. For Barla, despite the depredations of 14 turns of nomadic life and endless pregnancies as tokens of Dowell's esteem, still retained a beautiful face and a slender figure. Aramina was old enough to realize that Barla was far more handsome than most holdless women, and that when they entered a new hold, Barla kept her lustrous hair hidden under a tattered headscarf and wore the many-layered garments of cold poverty. Dowell had been a skilled wood joiner, holding a modest but profitable hold for Lord Cale in the forests of Ruata. News of the treacherous massacre of the entire bloodline had reached the mountain fastness long after the event, when a contingent of Fax's rough troops had thundered into the hold's yard and informed the astounded Dowell of the change in Lord Holder. He had bowed his head reluctantly but wisely to that announcement, and kept his resentment and horror masked, hoping that none of the troop realized that his wife, Barla, expecting her first child, also bore Ruatan blood in her veins. If Dowell hoped that a meek acceptance and an isolated location would keep him from Fax's notice, he erred. The leader of the troop had eyes in his head. If he couldn't detect Barla's bloodline at a glance, one look was enough to tell him that here was a woman of interest to Lord Fax. Nor had the man's shrewd gleam escaped Dowell, and the woodcrafter had made contingency plans which began with leaving the hold's gather wagon and 2 sturdy dray beasts in a blind valley on the Tillich side of the mountain. When half a turn had passed, with no further visitation, Dowell had begun to think his precautions foolish, that he had mistaken the man's reaction to Barla's beauty. Then Lord Fax, followed by a score of his men, came galloping up the narrow trace to the woodland hold. His scowl had been frightening when he had seen Barla's gravid state.
"Well, the pump will be primed and ready. She'll whelp soon. Collect her in 2 months. See that she is waiting for her Lord Holder's summons."
Without a backward look, Fax had cruelly spun his runner about, and clouting the lathered creature with his rawhide whip, clattered back the way he had come. Dowell and Barla had left their hold within the hour. 7 days later, a boy had been prematurely born and died. Nor did Dowell and Barla find a ready sanctuary in Tillich's hold.
"Not this close to Fax, man. Perhaps farther west," their first host had suggested. "I don't want him knocking on my hold door. Not that one."
Dowell and Barla had traveled ever since, to the western reach of Tillich, where they had found brief respites in their journeyings, while Dowell carved bowls and cups, or joined cabinets or crafted gather wagons. A few weeks here, a half-turn there, and Aramina was born on their way through the mountains of Fort, the first of Barla's children to survive birth. The news of Fax's death caught up with them in the vast plains of Karoon just after Nex's birth. Ruata Hold brought Fax nothing but disease and trouble, the harper told Dowell and Barla in Karoon Beast Hold, where Dowell was building stables. Then we could return and claim our hold again.
"If there's anything to claim. But I'm told that Lytall is a fair man and he'll need good workers," the harper had said, eyeing the notched timbers that Dowell had fitted.
"We'll return then," Dowell had told Barla, "when I've finished my bond with the master craftsman." More than a full turn later, they did begin the long journey up the Karoon Peninsula with a sturdy daughter, a small son, and a tiny baby. Then thread began to fall on the innocent green land, raining destruction on a population that had denied the existence of their ancient enemy. Once again, dragons filled the skies with their fiery breath, charring the dread menace in midair, saving the rich land from the devouring thread. Travel became more hazardous than ever for the holdless. People clung to the safety of stone walls and stout doors, and to the traditional leadership of their lord holders. Within those sanctuaries, there was little room for those without legitimate claim on leadership, supplies, and refuge. A new terror was visited on the unfortunate, deprived for any number of reasons of their right to hold or craft affiliation. For Dowell and Barla, the terror was slightly abated by Aramina's unexpected ability to hear dragons. When she first naively reported such conversations, she had been soundly spanked for telling lies. Then came the day when she persisted in warning them that her dragon said threadfall was imminent. Threatened with a second thrashing and a supperless night, she had tearfully refused to retract her report. It was only when Dowell saw the leading edge of thread, a silver smudging in the sky, dotted with the fiery blossoms of dragon breath, that he had apologized. As the family lay crouched under a rocky ledge just large enough to shelter them, they were grateful to her. "The lords of Ruata have always given Dragonriders complete hospitality," Barla had said, shielding the squalling Nexa against her shoulder. She had to stop to wipe grit from her lips. "No one in my immediate family was ever taken on search. But then, there haven't been that many searches in my lifetime. Aramina comes by her talent as a right of blood." "And to think I ever complained that our firstborn was female," Dowell had murmured, smiling at Aramina tucked in the safest angle of the rock ledge. "I wonder if Nexa will be able to hear dragons." "I'll bet I will when I'm older," Pell had ventured, not wishing to let his sister take all the honors. "It means we'll be safe traveling across Telgar Plains to Ruata, for Aramina can always warn us about Threadfall. We won't need to be beholden to any lord for shelter." To be without restraint or obligation meant a great deal to Dowell's pride. Since the advent of Threadfall, the holdless had suffered more than the usual indignities at the hands of holders, large and small. Having no right of affiliation, they could be cheated of the ordinary rights of hospitality, overcharged for any goods their infrequent marks could purchase, forced to work unnatural hours for the mere privilege of shelter from thread, deprived of dignity and honor, and, above all else, required to express gratitude for even the least condescension shown by holders and crafters. The elation of the small family was short-lived, for their dray beasts had run off in the panic of Threadfall. Dowell was forced to return to Karoon Beasthold on foot, hire his skill at a hard-bargained price for the next turn, then trudge all the way back with the new team to where his family had waited, fearful of marauding, holdless men and women, and Threadfall. The indenture over, Dowell had once again turned team and wagon westward. A miscarriage and fever had forced them to take refuge in the huge Eigen cave, and expediency had kept them there, when Dowell's resolution had faltered under a series of misfortunes, all apparently designed to thwart his repatriation to Ruata Hold. Now they pushed on through the night, struggling to escape yet another threat to honor and resolve. From somewhere, Dowell had acquired a map of Lamos Hold, complete with road, track, and trace. Lamos had so many forests and mountains that rivers, Pern's other roadways, were unusable. Dowell elected to follow the faintest of tracks and was careful to remove any droppings. When he finally allowed them to rest, it was noontime. During the brief respite he allowed his family and team, Dowell crushed leaves and stained the wagon's leather cover with green to make it less visible to any searching eye. "We'll be safe in the forests of Lamos," he said, reassuring himself as well as his family. "There are caves there in the mountains which no one could find." "If no one can find them, how will we?" asked Pell reasonably. "Because we'll be looking very hard, of course," Aramina answered, before her weary father's short temper flared. "And we'll live by ourselves, and thrive on the provender that woods naturally provide us," Aramina went on, "for we'll have all the wood we need to be warm, and nuts, and roots because we know where to look for them, and berries and roast wary." "Roast wary?" Pell's eyes widened with delight at such a promise. "Because you fashioned such excellent snares." "I always caught more tunnel snakes than anyone else at Eigen," Pell began. Then, remembering that this helter-skelter trip was due to his boastfulness, he covered his mouth with his hand and huddled into a tight ball of remorse. "Any of the forest caves ought to have lots of snakes, shouldn't they, Mother?" Aramina asked, wanting to lighten her mother's sad face as well as her brother's guilt. "They should," Barla agreed in the absent way of parents who have not really attended to their children's conversation. Dowell called them to order, and they continued on their way until Nudge refused to go farther, and when Dowell took the stick to him, sank resolutely to his knees. Unhitching the recalcitrant brute, they forced Shove to haul the wagon into the brush at the side of the trace. "Nudge has got sense," Pell muttered to his sister as the weary children gathered enough branches to screen the wagon. "Father has too. I certainly didn't want to help Tella or—" And Aramina shivered with revulsion. "That dragonless man, Giron. They're as bad as Fax. Worse." Although Barla roused herself sufficiently to hand out dry rations, she found that Aramina and Pell had fallen asleep. Only when they had put 4 mountains between themselves and Eigen River did Dowell let up on the pace he had set. On the narrow traces, more logging tracks than proper trails, there were none to witness their passage as they climbed higher into the vast Lemos range. They were not quite alone, for dragons passed overhead on daily sweeps, and Aramina reveled in their conversations. She made her reports amusing, to liven evening campfire, for Dowell had conceded that a careful, smokeless fire would not be easily seen in the thick woods. "It was Greenpath again today, with Heth and Monarth," Aramina said on the 10th day after their exodus from Eigen Cave. "Lamanth, the queen, has clutched 30 fine eggs, but Monarth says there are no queen eggs." "There aren't always queen eggs," Dowell reminded Aramina, who sounded unhappy. "That's what Path said. I don't know why Monarch was upset." "I didn't realize the dragons talked to each other," Barla remarked, puzzled. "I thought they only talked to their riders." "Oh, they do," Aramina assured her. "Heth talks constantly to Kavan when they're doing the sweep alone." "Why are there 3 today, then?" Pell asked. "Because Threadfall is imminent." "Why didn't you say so?" Dowell wanted to know, exasperated with his daughter's diffidence. "I was going to. They think Threadfall will come over Lemos tomorrow late afternoon." "How can we survive Threadfall out in these woods?" Dowell demanded, angry with apprehension. "You said there were lots of caves here in Lemos," Pell said, grimacing his face into a tearful expression. "We'll need one," Dowell said grimly. "We'll start first light tomorrow. Aramina, you and Pell will search ahead, on the upper slope, for there is bare cliff above us, and somewhere there must be a cave for shelter." "And we'll need more roots and anything else you can find to eat," Barla added, showing the empty stew pot as proof of the need. "There's naught left of the dried meat and vegetables." "Why is it Thread always comes at times like these?" Pell asked, but expected no answer to his plaint. He had occasion to repeat much the same expression the next morning, when the off-rear wheel, sinking in a leaf-covered hole, cracked the cotter pin and lazily spun off. The team dragged the wagon on for several lengths, grinding the hub into the dirt before Dowell was able to halt them. Grimly he surveyed the damage. Then, with a sigh of long-suffering patience, he set to the job of repairing the wheel. It was by no means the first time that wheels had come off, and Aramina and Pell needed no instructions to search out stout limbs and to help roll a boulder into place for the lever. Indeed, it was a well-drilled operation, and Aramina and Pell had wedged 2 blocks under the wagon bed as soon as Dowell and Barla had levered it up. They had the wheel back on the axle when Dowell discovered that there were no more cotter pins or kingpins in the wagon. He'd used the last on the journey to Eigen Cave and had no reason to replace them in the long turn. "With the world and all of wood about us, Dowell?" Barla had remonstrated to cut short his flow of self-recriminations. "There's a hardwood over there. It can't take much time to whittle new pegs. The children can forage ahead for food in a cave. Come." She handed him the hatchet. "I'll help. Aramina, take a sack and one of the hide buckets. Pell, make one of your snares, and set it if you cross Snake Spoor. Nexa, you may carry the small shovel, but don't lose it in the woods." "If you hear more about Threadfall from the dragons, Aramina, you come back to me straight away," Dowell added as he made for the hardwood visible from the track. "Don't dally." With a spirit of urgent adventure, the 3 children ran up the track. For the first 4 switchbacks, there was nothing but forest on either side, though Pell insisted on inspecting several outcroppings of the gray rock that he felt looked promising. Then the logging trace started a long, straight run, which finally disappeared around a rocky outthrust. To their right, up a steep bank, The trees were sparser as the native rock intruded. "I'll go up there, Mina," Pell cried, and took off just as Nexa called Aramina's attention to the unmistakable, if withered, tops of red roots growing on the downside. Aramina saw Pell scrambling for footing on the steep and slippery bank, and elected to forage with Nexa. They had been digging for only a short while when Aramina heard Pell's warbling, the family signal for an emergency. Fearful that he had injured himself climbing, Aramina raced back to the track. "I found a cave, Mina! I found a cave!" Pell slithered back down the bank. "A good deep one. Room for nudge and shove, too." His voice reflected the jouncing his body took as he half walked, half slid the remaining distance to his sister. "And lost your gathering," she said sternly, pointing to the cluster of broken bulge-nut twigs he still clutched in his left hand. "Oh, them." Pell tossed the useless bits aside, stood up, and brushed the wet leaves from his leathern pants. "There's plenty more where they—" He broke off, an uncertain look on his face as his hand hesitated. Sprung the seams again, too," Aramina said impatiently, and grabbing him, swung him around to see the damage the slide had done in his trousers. She sighed, controlling her temper. Pell never considered risk and consequence. "Only the seam, not the leather. Mother can mend it. In the cave I just found. Plenty of space." Grinning broadly to soothe the frown from his sister's face, he made exaggerated gestures with his arms, outlining the splendor of his discovery. "How far up the slope?" Aramina regarded the steep incline with a thoughtful eye. "I'm not sure Nudge and Shove could make it." "They'll make it, 'cause there's grass and water." "The cave is damp?" "Nah, dry as far in as I went." Pell cocked his head sideways. "And I didn't go all the way in, just like you always warned me. Only far enough to see it was big and dry. And the tunnel snake signs. Good eating." He rolled his eyes and smacked his lips at the prospect. "There's even a stream and a cascade, too." Aramina hesitated, eyeing the steep bank and wondering if Pell's enthusiasm hadn't clouded his judgment. Pell would go through life seeing only what he hoped he was seeing, not what really was. But the need to get under shelter was critical. No matter if Pell had exaggerated, he had found a cave. Her father could decide on its suitability. "How far up the slope is it?" "Straight to the top of the ridge," Pell pointed, "down into the dip past the nut plantation. Turn to your right at the forked birch, and you'll stare right at the entrance. Only it's to the left. A good overhang. Come on, I'll show you." "No, you wait here. Nexa's down there digging roots." Aramina pulled a face at her brother's sour expression. "Which we need nearly as much as the cave." She hesitated once more. Maybe she ought to check the cave first rather than raise false hopes. "Mina, I wouldn't lie about shelter." Aramina scrutinized her brother's face, his features contorted into an expression of utter trustworthiness. No, Pell wouldn't lie about something that important. A ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, lancing past the sloughing tree branches, reminding her that there was little time left if they were to be under cover when Thread fell. "Don't wander off. You know how scared Nexa gets." Aramina threw a deft twist of cord about the neck of her root sack and tossed it to the side of the logging track. "I won't stir from her side, but I expect I'd do better gathering kindling." Thus avoiding his most hated chore of rooting, Pell diligently collected branches. Aramina started off down the track in a lope, her long plaits bouncing off her shoulders and buttocks. She was light on her feet, moving with an economy of movement that would have been envied by a hold runner. The sunlight seemed to follow her, illuminating her way on the overgrown trace, the springiness underfoot making the going a pleasure. She shortened her stride as the track switched back on itself, and listened intently over the thud of her footfalls for the sound of the wagon. Surely it hadn't taken her father too long to whittle the necessary pins. Dowell and Barla should have made some distance up the logging road. Surely she ought to have heard the lumbering wagon, her father's voice urging Nudge and Shove to their task. Peering through the thickly planted trees, Aramina looked for some glimpse of the covered wagon. Apprehension lent her impetus, and down the trace she sped, every nerve anxiously alert for any reassuring sight or sound. Faster she ran, positive now in her mind that something had happened. Could Lady Holdless Tella have possibly caught up with them? Taking a more direct line, she bypassed the next turn and pushed through the underbrush, wiggling past trees. Then, as she discerned the bulk of the green-smeared wagon cover through the trees, she moved more circumspectly. The wagon had not shifted from the spot in which they had left it 2 hours past. Trembling with fear, Aramina paused, listening now for the sound of voices, for the bass rumble of Giron or the crisp acid alto of Tilda. Hearing nothing but the wind soughing through the leafless trees, she moved cautiously down until she was poised on the bank above where the wagon was still canted. Muffling a cry of fear, Aramina slid down the bank, recoiling in horror as she saw her father's head and shoulders protruding from under the wagon. Somehow the blocks had slipped, and the wheel lay once again on its side. Horrified, Aramina was certain that her father had been crushed to death, until she saw that one block had fallen directly under the wagon bed, preventing the complete collapse of the heavy load onto her father's chest. Only then did Aramina hear the hoarse grunt and half sob as she realized that her mother was attempting to lever the wagon bed off her stricken husband. "Mother! I cannot lift it, Mina," Barla sobbed, leaning exhaustedly against the pole. "I've been trying and trying." Wasting no words, Aramina threw her weight onto the lever, and though Barla gave every remaining ounce of her strength, the two women could not summon enough mass between them to shift the wagon more than a finger's breadth. "Oh, Mina, what can we do? Even if we had Pell and Nexa, they couldn't help enough." Defeated, Barla slumped onto the ground, weeping. "We lifted it enough. If Pell and Nexa were here, they could pull him free." Aramina swung round to her father, his tanned face pale with shock, the pulse in his neck beating slowly but reassuringly. "Pell's found a cave. It's not too far up the track. I'll be right back." Giving Barla no chance to protest, Aramina started up the track again as fast as she could run. Pell and Nexa just had to be strong enough. She didn't dare believe anything else, and they must hurry. The sun glancing into her eyes warned her that time was very short if they were to rescue Dowell and get the wagon up the trail to the cave. She couldn't consider any other problems then, only the most immediate ones, and she almost ignored the sight of the dragon gliding overhead. She stopped so fast that she almost fell. "Dragon? Dragon, hear me! Help me! Help me!" Aramina had never attempted to communicate with the dragons, but a dragon rider would be strong enough to help her. Surely a dragon rider would not ignore her need. "Who calls a dragon?" She recognized the voice of Heth. "It is Aramina, down on the logging trace above the river in the forest. Please help me. My father is trapped beneath our wagon, and Thread will fall soon." She jumped up and down in the middle of the trace, waving frantically. "Oh, please help me." "No need to shout. I heard you the first time. My rider wants to know who you are." To her relief, Aramina saw the dragon change directions, circling down toward the track. "I told you I'm Aramina." "May I tell him?" Such consideration rarely came Aramina's way. Yes, of course. Are you Heth?" "I am Heth. My rider is Kavan." "How do you do?" "I'd do better if we could see you." "But I'm right here, in the middle of the trace, and the wagon is large. Oh, my father painted it green. If you'll just fly lower." "I'm a dragon, not a wary. Kavan sees the wagon." Aramina crashed through the underbrush to reach the wagon at the same time as dragon and rider. Barla looked about to faint with shock at their sudden appearance. "It's all right, Mother. They'll help us. They're much stronger than Pell and Nexa would be." Then Aramina realized that Shove and Nudge were taking great exception to the proximity of a dragon. She tied them tightly down by their nose rings to the tetherstone, giving them more immediate pain to occupy their stupid brains. Fortunately, the dragon rider directed Heth to land behind the wagon, out of the dray beast's immediate sight. To her dismay, Aramina realized that both dragon and rider were young. She'd always thought that bronze dragons must be big, and indeed Heth had seemed enormous outlined in the sky. But now she could see that he wasn't fully grown, and that his rider Kavan was both undersized and younger than herself. As if Kavan sensed her disappointed appraisal, he straightened his shoulders and jerked his chin up. He walked forward, taking in the lever propped against the boulder and looking down at the prostrate Dowell. "We may be weirlings, but we can help you," Kavan said without ostentation. He turned to Heth. "What I want you to do is put heave on this, Heth, with your forearms. Come on, Aramina." Aramina stopped staring at the bronze dragon, who waddled forward to place his 5 clawed paws about the lever. "Not until I say go, Heth," Kavan cautioned, grinning a bit at Aramina as they knelt in the dust beside the unconscious Dowell, fastening their hands under the man's armpits. "Heave, Heth! Heave!" As quickly as they could, Aramina and Kavan hauled Dowell's body from under the wagon. With a cry of incredulous relief, Barla rushed to her husband's side, opening his shirt to judge the extent of his injury. Kavan had the presence of mind to replace the fallen block and prop the wagon up. "You'll need the wheel back on," he said to Aramina. "That was fine, Heth." "I am very strong," said the dragon, with a trace of smugness, his great faceted eyes whirling bluey-green as he maintained pressure on the lever. "Oh, you are indeed, you beautiful, beautiful creature," cried Aramina. "All right, Heth. Ease it down," said Kavan, holding the block in place. "Slowly now." The wagon settled, creaking as the block took its weight. Kavan fumbled about in the grass and dust and triumphantly held up the pegs. "Mother?" Aramina's trembling voice held a question as she turned to look at her father. "I can't find anything broken," Barla said in a low, unsteady voice. "But look." Her hand indicated the terrible line of bruising already discoloring the skin. Carefully she smoothed the hair back from Dowell's brow, her expression of concerned tenderness causing the 2 young people to exchange embarrassed glances. Kavan touched Aramina's arm. "Do you know how to set the wheel back on the axle?" He gave her a rueful glance as he proffered the pegs. "I don't." "Why ever should you?" Aramina wanted to know as she took the pegs and noticed with a pang how carefully Dowell had made a cotter hole in the kingpin. "You're a Dragonrider." "Not all that long," he said with a grin as he helped her lift the wheel and roll it into position. "And weirlings are taught a little bit of every craft needed by the weir. You never know when something will come in handy. Like now." He said this on the end of a grunt as the 2 young people tried to force the wheel onto the axle. "It's the dirt encrusted on the hub," Aramina said as Kavan paused uncertainly. With her belt knife, she scraped off the caked dirt, found a large rock, and with a healthy knock set the wheel firmly on. With another few taps of her rock, she rammed the kingpin through and then the cotter pin into its place. "You're deft at that," Kavan said admiringly. "Practice." With Heth's assistance, they removed the block from under the wagon. "Have you far to go?" Kavan asked then. "Thread falls soon, and as I recall, the Forester's Hold is a long ways up the track." Barla stifled a sound in her throat, but Aramina had an answer ready. "I know," Aramina lied calmly, "but this accident delayed us. However, there's a cave not far up the track where we can wait out Threadfall." "Is it large?" asked Kavan. "Large enough. Why?" Aramina asked, suddenly wary. "Well, just before you called us," and Kavan grinned ingenuously for her temerity, "Heth spotted a band of runners beyond the river. Are they part of your group?" "No," Barla groaned aloud, looking wildly up at Aramina. "There shouldn't be anyone else in this part of Lord Asganar's forests," Aramina said, with all the indignation she could muster. "We were warned that holdless raiders have been seen." "Holdless men?" Kavan was instantly alert. "If they are, they'll disperse once they've seen me. Look, let me help you get your father into the wagon and see you safely on your way to the cave. I'll take care of the raiders, and warn Lord Asganar, too." Aramina hadn't expected that, but she said what was appropriate, determined to play out her part in this charade. She unfastened the tailgate so that they could slide Dowell in. Then, while Kavan watched beside Heth, she and Barla took up their positions and prodded Nudge and Shove into a walk, and then into a shambling trot up the trace. Barla and Aramina had to keep hard at the dray beasts to maintain their trot. Nudge resented the pace, twisting his horned head and lowing piteously, but Aramina had no mercy on him. Women and beasts were sweating when they finally reached the bank, Pell cheering lustily until Aramina shouted at him to stop being so foolish and come help. In a few terse words, Aramina explained what had happened, and Pell began shaking his head slowly from side to side. "I don't know how we'll get Father up that bank," he said, appraising the difficulty. "You shouldn't have sent the Dragonrider away." "It's not just Father being hurt, Pell. Kavan saw a troop of riders on the other side of the river." Pell quailed, and his distress communicated itself to Nexa, who had been standing there wide-eyed and perplexed. Now she burst into tears. "So we must also get the wagon out of sight, and hide Nudge and Shove." "But Thread's coming, and we have to get Father up to the cave, and—" Pell's words tripped over themselves in his anxiety. "Somehow we'll do it," Aramina said, peering up and down the trace to find a possible screen for the mass of the wagon. "Maybe, if Kavan has frightened them with Threadfall, they'll have to go back the way they came. Maybe if we rig a stretcher, we can haul Father up the bank. Maybe, Pell almost danced with frustration. "I won't have you children fighting at a time like this," Barla said tartly, appearing in the back of the wagon. "We've got to rouse your father. How long before Thread falls, Aramina? Or didn't you ask the Dragonrider?" Aramina bowed her head at her mother's rebuke. As she did so, her glance fell on a group of evergreens on the left-hand side of the roadway, a few lengths farther up the track. "There!" she cried dramatically, gesturing wildly. "There! We can drive the wagon in there behind the evergreens. They're just tall enough." With something constructive to do, even Nexa stopped her whinging. Dowell was carefully lifted out of the wagon and covered by a sleeping fir. Then everyone concentrated on getting the wagon out of sight. Nexa was directed to brush away the tracks of the wagon as Aramina and Pell forced the dray beast through the opening Barla parted into the copse. The artistic addition of extra branches completed the camouflage. Then Barla sent Pell and Nexa on ahead to the cave with sleeping firs and Barla's precious stew-pot, while Aramina and her mother tried to rouse Dowell. The usual aromatic had no effect, and the two women exchanged anxious glances. Then suddenly Nudge and Shove, tethered by the trace, began to moan fearfully and pull at their ring ropes. "Thread!" gasped Barla, bending protectively over her husband. "No!" cried Aramina. "Dragons! Big dragons!" Indeed, it seemed to her as if the sky was filled with them, their great wings causing the saplings to bend to their backwind. "Aramina, how did that Dragonrider come to help us in the first place?" "You didn't call him, did you?" When Aramina mutely nodded, Barla gave a despairing cry. "But the Weirs will take you from us if they know you can hear and speak to dragons. And then what shall we do?" "How else were we to save Father?" asked Aramina, even as she, too, regretted her action. "I hear, Aramina," said Heth's unmistakable voice. "Oh, please, go away, Heth. Say you can't find me." "But I have. You must not fear. We won't harm you." Before Aramina could speak again, 3 dragons skimmed neatly down onto the track, making Nudge and Shove buck and strain to be free of their tether. As one, Barla and Aramina dashed forward to prevent the escape of the dray beasts, twisting the nose rings until pain paralyzed the stupid animals. "We will move down the track," Aramina heard Heth say as she coped with the frantic Nudge. When the dragons were far enough away not to be an immediate threat, Aramina and Barla relaxed their hold. "I am Tjellen, Bronze Rider of Monarth, and this is Miriam, who rides Greenpath," said the oldest of the 3 riders who approached them. "Gavan wisely called for help to persuade those holdless raiders to absent themselves from this vicinity, so I thought we'd better make sure you had safely reached shelter before Threadfall." Barla hovered between her critical need for assistance and anxiety at the presence of Dragonriders who might very easily depart with her daughter who could hear dragons. "We don't have much time to spare," Tjellen added, squinting at the steep bank. "And I don't fancy trying to haul an unconscious man up that." "Is there any sort of a clearing by your cave?" Miriam asked Aramina. "A small one," she said, devoutly hoping that Pell's description bore some resemblance to fact. "Path, would you oblige us?" Miriam asked the green dragon. "I see no reason why not." In a maneuver that Aramina couldn't believe she was seeing, the green dragon glided to the group without moving her wings or appearing to walk. "Silly beasts, aren't they?" Path added as Nudge and Shove began their terrified lowing again. Aramina was obliged to go calm them. Their perturbation abruptly ceased as Miriam, Path, her father, and her mother disappeared. "Well, it seemed easier to send your mother along too, Aramina," Tigellin said with a laugh for her astonishment. "You'd best go the hard way. Thread will fall very shortly." "But I can't nudge and shove." Kavan grinned. "Just get on one. Get a good hold on the nose rein of the other. We'll supply the impulsion." And he jerked his thumb at the two dragons, watching with their jewel eyes whirling mildly. It was perhaps the wildest ride Aramina had ever had. In the first place, dray beasts were not designed for comfortable riding, having straight backs, wide withers, short necks, and low-held heads. However, the flapping of dragon wings behind Nudge and Shove was more than enough to have sent them plunging through fire. They took the bank, cloven hooves slipping on the wet footing in no more than 4 bucking jumps. Momentum carried them over the top and down the dip, almost right into the cliff wall, where they fetched up to a dead stop that sent Aramina onto Nudge's horns, and then to the ground with a force that jarred her from heel to head bones. Hell appeared, eyes wide at her impetuous arrival. "A girl and a green dragon brought father and mother. I didn't think girls were allowed to ride fighting dragons." "Help me get these inside the cave before they stampede again," Aramina said, though she had been equally surprised by Miriam and Path. "Oh, look, they're going!" Pell's disappointment was patent as he saw the dragons hover briefly in the sky. "I'm forever missing the good parts," he complained. "Get Shove inside." Aramina had no time to humor her brother, and she gave him such a hard prod that he sharply reminded her that he wasn't any old dray beast. He hauled on the nose rein, and lowing, Shove followed his painful muzzle, then bellowed as his hindquarters scraped along the right wall of the narrow entry. Aramina pushed at his dappled flanks and set him right. She was careful to line Nudge squarely in the opening, and to prevent any further recalcitrance she twisted his nose ring. With an injured bellow, he, too, made the passage into the cave, running into Aramina, who stopped, amazed at what lay before her. "Isn't this cave marvelous, Mina? Didn't I find a good one? Couldn't we get everything in here? Maybe we could even live here." Pell dropped his voice to a hoarse whisper on the last sentence. "For it's as big as a hold, isn't it, Mina?" The boy was all but dancing at the end of Shove's ring rein, momentarily oblivious of everything but his need for her approval. In a sweeping glance, Aramina saw a solemn-faced Nexa cradling her father's head, where he lay on the pile of sleeping furs, and her mother busy lighting a small fire within a ring of stones before she allowed herself to examine the cave in more detail. "Why, it is truly big enough to be a hold," she said in a voice awed enough to delight her brother. "It's bigger than many holds we've been in, Mina," Pell said with great satisfaction. "Much bigger. It's nearly as big as any of the Eigen caverns I ever was in." Aramina appraised the high ceiling, dry as far as she could see in the dim light filtering in from the entrance. She could sense rather than see clearly that the cave extended far beyond the immediate chamber in which they stood. "There's even a sort of stall place where we can tether Nudge and Shove," he went on, babbling happily, and pulled on Shove to lead the way. The beasts settled. Aramina and Pell came back to the front of the cavern where Barla was coaxing the flames on the small hearth. Then a soft moan broke the silence as Dowell rolled his head from side to side in Nexa's lap. She snatched her hands away from him, as if contact might somehow impede his recovery. With startled eyes, she looked about for reassurance. "There now, Nexa, I told you he'd come around," said Barla, rising from the now healthy fire. "Aramina will need fresh water, as cold as you can draw it. We've nothing but cold compresses to ease the bruising. And hurry. Those Dragonriders said that Threadfall was a matter of minutes away. "Mina!" And Pell caught the other side of the bucket, accompanying his sister out of the cavern. "Can you hear him yet?" Aramina halted at the entrance, listening with every fiber in her ears, smiled at Pell, and walked quickly out. "Show me where the water is," she said, and Pell danced around in front of her and to their left. "Right here, right here," he caroled, pointing and dancing about. "Just like I said. You won't ever doubt me again, will you, Mina?" "No, I won't," she said, smiling as she extended her hand into the little cascade that leaped and fell down the side of the mountain. The water was ice-cold, numbing her fingers in seconds. She filled the bucket. She was just at the entrance to the cave when Pell let out an excited whoop. At the same time she heard a multitude of voices, excited and anticipatory. "They're here! I can see them! I saw them first!" His triumph found a lack in her talent. "Well, I can hear them talking. Can I watch the dragons fight Thread this time, Nina? This time can I watch?" Aramina shushed him, examining the overhang of the cavern. Unless Thread should happen to fall at a tremendous velocity and at a slant, she couldn't see how any of the dreaded menace could score them. Turns of familiarity with Thread had dampened her fear of it. "Yes, I think it's safe here for us to watch." She placed a warning finger on her lips, and slipping quickly inside to bring her mother the bucket of cold water, she rejoined him in the entrance. To Pell's keen disappointment, there wasn't as much to watch as he'd anticipated. They could see the dragons in their ranks, suspended motionless in the clear mountain air, gleaming where wing and body reflected the sun briefly. Then the two watching children saw the sudden blurring of the sky, the silvery mist that was the leading edge of Thread. Only then did the dragons break the temporary suspension, swooping up to meet the deadly rain, sending blossoms of fiery breath to char the parasitic Thread. Pell didn't breathe with the wonder of the darting forays of the smaller dragons, exclaiming as he saw a long tongue of flame reach out to char a mass of Thread. Silver mist turned to black smoke, and then dissipated lazily. Fire blooms traced the dragons' progress after their ancient enemy until the hills and trees covered the distant sight from the watchers' searching eyes. "It didn't last long enough," Pell said dejectedly. "It'll last long enough for the Dragonriders, I'm sure," Aramina said with mild rebuke for his callousness. "Did you remember to bring the roots with you?" "Ah, who wants to eat roots? There are acres of nuts out there." "Then you'll have no trouble filling a sack, will you?" As Aramina turned back to the fire, she heard her father's querulous voice. "I don't understand how you managed with just Aramina." "Pell was a great help, too," Barla said soothingly, wringing out another cold compress. She gave Aramina a quick, stern glance. "It was really very simple, Father. You keep telling us that if there was a lever long enough, we could even move Pern away from the Red Star," Aramina said with a smile. "This is no time for levity," Barla said severely. "Why ever not? Father's conscious. We've got this huge big cave all to ourselves, and Pell's gone out for more of those delicious nuts." Expertly, Aramina positioned two in her palm and cracked them. "See?" She held out the meats to Barla. After a supper of boiled roots and crisp nut meats, Aramina and Pell used the last of the daylight to gather fodder for nudge and shove, and sufficient boughs and fragrant bracken for bedding. Tired as she was, Aramina found that sleep eluded her. She had been brought up to honor truth, and today that teaching had been disregarded for expediency. She had permitted Kavan to think that they were proper holders on their lord's business. She had avoided truth with her father, although at Barla's behest, so as not to worry him. In each case the truth would confound her lies in very short order. But Kavan had chased off the Lady Holdless Tella, and the band that had nearly caught up with her and her family, and they had contrived to get Dowell safely into this cave refuge, hopefully without leaving an easy trail that Tella could follow. But to achieve that end, she had revealed her ability to hear dragons to bend and wear riders, and the Dragonriders now knew exactly where she was, even if Lady Holdless Tella did not. She could not imagine what punishment would be meted out to her for that day-long imprudence. Nexa, curled close against her sister's body, whimpered in a restless sleep. Aramina pulled the sleeping rug closely about her, stroking her arm, and Nexa subsided into sleep. For a while she was distracted by Dowell's breathing, a light snore because he had to sleep on his back, but its soft rhythm finally lulled Aramina to sleep. It seemed all too short a time before Pell was urgently tugging at her shoulders and whispering excitedly in her ear, "Mina, Mina, Kavan is here, and so is the Weir leader. He wants to speak to you, and there are lots of strange men out there, too." "Here?" Frantically brushing sleep from her eyes, Aramina sat up, all too aware of yesterday's bruises and scrapes, and the dull ache across her shoulders from abused muscles. "No, on the track. The men are armed with bows and arrows and spears, and I think the dragons brought them." Pell's eyes were wide with excitement. Kavan was just beyond him. "It's all right, Aramina. Really it is," said Kavan softly so as not to disturb the other sleepers. "It's the raiders, you see." Careful not to rouse Nexa, Aramina slipped out from under the fur and pressed it gently down about her sister. "The raiders are coming?" Pell's voice slipped from whisper to harsh alarm, but Aramina quickly covered his mouth. Fear darkened his eyes as he stared at his sister. "The little one is suddenly afraid," said a surprised, richly mellow voice. "She has more to fear from the holdless." The second dragon voice was deep and dark, like a pool of the black water that Aramina had seen in Aigen. "I am not afraid of you," Aramina spoke stoutly. "Of me?" Kavan asked in astonishment, his hand on his chest. "Not you, those dragons." No, Aramina told herself, she was not afraid of the dragons, but of their riders and the impending justice that would be meted out for all the lies of yesterday. She hoped that Kavan would not think too badly of her. "I don't think badly of you," Kavan protested as they stepped out into the sunlight. "Why should I? I think you were an absolute marvel yesterday, fixing that wheel and getting everyone safe inside the cave." "Oh, you don't understand," said Aramina, trying to keep her voice from breaking. "And neither does Hef, but—" "It will come right," said Hef, as if he meant it. Then they were at the top of the bank, and Aramina held on to a sapling to steady herself at the sight of masses of armed men, just as Pell had reported, and an incredible stream of dragons, taking off and landing in the track. Standing slightly apart with the enormous bronze dragon and a brown almost as big was the Weir leader Flar and his wing leader Fënor, talking earnestly with two men dressed in gleaming mail. A fur-trimmed cape was slung negligently over the shoulders of the younger man. "Are those who I think they are?" asked Pell in an odd whisper. His hands clasped in his sister's arm for reassurance. Then he stiffened, for Fënor had seen the three standing on the bank. He smiled and beckoned them down. Aramina prayed earnestly that she wouldn't lose her footing and arrive in an ignominious heap at the bottom of the slope. Then she felt Kavan's steadying hand. It was Pell who slipped, tumbling almost to the feet of the Weir leader, who, with an easy laugh, gave him a hand to his feet. Then Aramina and Kavan reached the group. "How is your father today?" Flar asked with a sympathetic smile. "Badly bruised, but sleeping, Lord Flar," Aramina managed to stammer. That was the correct form of address for the Weir leader of Pern, wasn't it? Aramina braced herself for the worst. "We'll hope not to disturb him, but those holdless marauders did not disperse after Threadfall." Flar's slight frown indicated his annoyance with that intransigence. "So," Fënor took up the explanation, "Lord Asganar plans to disperse them." He grinned as he gestured to the tall man. It was all Aramina could do to stand straight as she stared, appalled to be in the company of the Lord Holder, whose land had been invaded by impudent holdless raiders in pursuit of a trespassing holdless family. In a daze, she heard Lord Asganar wondering why the raiders were pressing so far into his forestry. She saw that men were marching down the track, quietly but in good array. "I have foresters in the top camp, although I cannot see what profit raiders could make of sawn logs," Lord Asganar was saying. End of Side 1.
Now the truth must out, to save good men from Lady Holdless Tella's brutal riders. It's me. Aramina's voice cracked so that her tentative admission was almost unheard. But the bronze dragon rumbled, and suddenly Falar was regarding her with a sharp and penetrating gaze. "You said that it was you, Aramina?" The two men turned to gaze down at her. Pel's fingers tightened about her arm. "You do not need to fear, child." "Nementh's quite right, Aramina. Would you explain?" "It's me. Because I can hear dragons. And the Lady Holdless Tella—" "Tella, is it?" exclaimed Lord Asganar, slapping his hand onto his sword hilt. "By the first egg, I've been longing to meet that one. Tella has been chasing you, child?" It was such a relief to admit to the first truth that her confession was almost incoherent, except that between her words Aramina kept hearing the reassurances of 3 dragon voices in her head, calming her, bidding her speak more slowly, and above all, not to be worried about a thing. "So, Tella thinks to search for what is the Weirs by right." Falar's amber eyes flashed with a fire no less frightening than dragon's breath. "And you and your family left Eigen Cave only 10 days ago? You have traveled hard to escape that woman. Where did you come from?" "Last turn my father bonded himself to Karun Beastmaster." "Then you are Caronese?" "No, Lord Falar. My father and mother had a small forest hold in Ruwata." Aramina stopped in mid-sentence, startled by the play of surprise and comprehension that flashed across the faces of the Dragonriders. "Lessa should have come after all, Falar," Fënor said, grinning with some private amusement at the Weir leader. "So, facts made your family holdless, Aramina." Falar's voice was kind, though his eyes still sparkled. Unable to speak, Aramina nodded. "And your father was a forester?" Lord Asganar's question was eager. Again Aramina could only nod. "He's the best wood-joiner and carver in all Pern." Pel spoke up, sensing a sympathy in their audience that Aramina, immersed in guilt, could not appreciate. "Is he now?" I thought as much." Falar took up the conversation, giving Aramina a chance to regain her poise. "That's a very well-made gather wagon you hide so neatly. We almost didn't spot it, did we, Asganar?" "Well hidden indeed. But I must go on, Falar. Fënor. My men are assembled. I'm leaving men to guard your cave, Aramina, so you will have absolutely nothing to fear from our Lady Holdless Tella. Not now or again. We'll see to that." And at his signal, 2 men ranged behind Aramina, Kavan, and Pel. As Aramina watched the tall young Lord Holder stride down the track to join his men, she began to feel secure for the first time since her first encounter with Tella and Giron. "We must leave too," Falar said to Fënor. "Can't let them sight dragons in the sky near this mountain. Aramina, Kavan brings some medicines for your father from our healer." "We do not like to be beholden to anyone," Aramina replied, as her parents had drilled her to say to any such well-meant offers. "We have all we need with us." She caught her lip to be telling yet another untruth. "But we," and Falar bowed slightly toward her, "are beholden to you for luring that hellion Tella near enough to grab her." "Oh." "Take the medicines, child. Ease your father's injuries," said Fënor, clasping Aramina's shoulders in his warm, gentle hands. He gave her a kindly little squeeze. "And don't be afraid." "I'm not afraid," Aramina replied, for she wasn't, not of the Weirmen. But what would her proud father say of her actions over the past 2 days? Then both Dragonriders quickly vaulted to their waiting dragons, swinging nimbly up onto the neck ridges. With mighty leaps that sent dust, pebbles, and bruised leaves flying, the 2 beasts launched themselves upward. Suddenly, the trace was empty of dragons and men. and only the two soldiers and the youngsters remained to hear the morning breeze sighing through the forest. "I wonder if they'd have taken me along to see Tella get trounced," Pell said, cocking his head around and beaming at the soldiers.
"Well now, lad, you should have asked, shouldn't you?" said the older guard. "Now, young lady, if you'll just lead the way to this cave of yours."
"Kavan, where's Heth got to? You're here, where's he?" Pell wanted to know, looking all about him as if the bronze dragon might be roosting in a nearby tree. "He's up at the cave, Pell, probably asleep in that small clearing, if it's big enough. Dragons like the sun, and we had a very busy day yesterday." "And a busy one so far today, too," Pell said amiably, digging his toes into the damp mulch of the bank.
"You could do with some steps cut in this bank," said the younger soldier, who had just slipped as far as he had come.
"Oh, we couldn't do that," Pell replied, horrified. "We don't really live in that cave. Though I'd sure like to," he added, with such ingenuousness that the older guard chuckled. "Can you make a good snare?" he asked him. "'Cause that cave is just crawling with tunnel snakes. They'd make mighty good eating after months and months of nothing but roots and fish."
"I tie a pretty good snare," Kavan said, grabbing a sapling to pull himself onto the top of the ridge.
"You? But you're a dragon rider."
"I wasn't always," Kavan admitted, grinning over Pell's head at Aramina. "Before I was a dragon rider, I was a very lowly weirboy, and small. Just the right size to set snares for tunnel snakes. My foster mother used to give 1/8 of a mark for every 50 snakes we caught."
"Really?"
Pell was awed by the thought of riches beyond the eating.
"Well," said Pell, recovering from his awe, "I'm bloody good at snake snaring, too, aren't I, Aramina?" "Not if you use the word bloody, you aren't," she said in reproof, not wishing the soldiers to think that the holdless were also mannerless. They had reached the clearing, and there was Heth, curled in a tight ball that just fit in the available space. The soldiers grinned as Pell, eyes wide, carefully circled the sleeping bronze dragon. "The cave is where, young lady?" asked the guard leader. Aramina pointed. There's water just to the right," Pell said hospitably. "And there's a whole grove of nuts just beyond the copse if you're hungry."
"Thank ye, lad, we've rations with us." The guard patted a bulging pouch. "Though a drink of cold water would be welcome. Traveling between sort of drives a man's mouth a spit. You go on in, tell your folks not to worry. We'll be out here on guard."
"I'd rather stay with you," Pell said confidentially.
Aramina caught the guard's expression and hastily vetoed that option.
"Ah, Aramina, you had all the fun yesterday." "Fun?"
Aramina got a firm grip on his arm and pulled him ruthlessly toward the cave entrance.
"Later, perhaps, Pell," Kavan said in the role of conciliator, "after you've eaten your breakfast, for I know I woke you out of a sound sleep. I've got enough claw here to serve everyone, and some bread because Mendy knew you wouldn't have had a chance to bake yesterday."
Kavan's engaging grin dared Aramina to reject the treats.
"Bread? Claw? What else do you have in that sack, Kavan?"
Pell, displaying the manners of the worst Eigen holdless riffraff, tried to pull open the neck of the sack for a glimpse of its contents.
"Pell!"
Aramina's shocked whisper reminded her brother of their sleeping parents as well as his manners.
"But, Mina, do you know how long it is since we had Claw?"
"I've promised to make it for the guards, Mina," Kavan said in a voice that had brought many around to indulge his whimsies.
"Surely a cup between friends."
She relented, though she was sure to receive a scolding on that account as well as for her other errors. But a cup of claw would do much to ease the trembling in her stomach and knees, and give her the energy to bear whatever other shocks this day might hold for her. The aroma, as it steeped, roused the sleepers, though Barla's first conscious act was to peer in her husband's face, reassured by the soft snores that emanated from his slightly open mouth. Only then did Barla react to the fragrance of the brewing claw. "We had no claw," she said, frowning at Aramina before she recognized Kavan beside the little hearth. "My foster mother, Mendy, sent it along with Thelis and numbweed salve to ease your husband's injuries," said Kavan, rising to bring her a cup of the fresh brew. He smiled with a shy charm to which Barla was scarcely impervious.
Aramina regarded the young bronze rider with astonishment. "My weir leaders insisted that I return to see if he is recovering from the accident." "That is kind of you, young Kavan, but unnecessary. We do not care to be beholden to anyone." Barla pretended not to see the cup he offered, but Aramina saw her mother's nostrils twitch in appreciation of the aromatic steam. Kavan gave her another of his charming smiles. "I'm weir-bred, you know," he said, undaunted, "so I know how you feel about being under obligation." When he saw Barla's incredulous expression, he went on. "Before the past began, Bendenweir was begrudged every jot and tittle because—" And now his voice became querulous, and his eyes took on a merry twinkle for his impersonation. "Everyone knows that thread won't fall on Pern again." He grinned impishly at Barla's astonishment and her sudden realization that Bendon had indeed once been relegated to a state not much different from that of the holdless, tolerated when unavoidable, ignored when possible, and condemned on every occasion for uselessness. "Drink, good lady, and enjoy it. Mendy also sent along bread, knowing you've had no chance to bake yesterday." "Mother, could we not send Mendy one of the wooden spoons Father carved at Eigen?" Aramina ventured to suggest to salve her mother's sensibility. "Yes. An exchange is always permissible," Barla replied, and inclining her head graciously, finally accepted the cup of claw. Relieved by her mother's capitulation, Aramina carefully cut a thick slice of the round loaf, spreading it generously with the jam that Kavan had also extracted from his sack of surprises. She bent a stern glance on Pell when he started to devour the treat ravenously. Only when she had served the others did Aramina eat, savoring the claw and the thick, crunchy bread spread with the berry jam. Daintily she even rescued the crumbs from her lap with a moistened fingertip. When Kavan and Pell went outside to serve the guards, Barla summoned Aramina to the sleeping firs, where she was delicately smearing numbweed salve on the livid bruises on Dowell's chest. "Why is that rider still here?" "He came back this morning, Mother." Then Aramina took a deep breath, realizing that only the truth would serve. Evasion was as dishonest as lying, whatever her motive. The presence of the Dragonriders and Lord Asganar would ensure the safety of everyone. With complete candor she accounted for her part in the events of the past day and this morning. "And the Bendenweir leader was just here with Lord Asganar and his men because Lady Holdless Tella has followed us. Lord Asganar is using this opportunity to ambush her and that horrid band of hers. So we'll be safe now, because Lord Asganar and Lord Flar think Father built a fine gather wagon. And truly they did call it a gather wagon, just as if that's all it ever has been." "That's what it was made for," said Dowell in a sad voice, slightly shaken by the pain of the shallow breaths he took to speak. "Here, Dowell, drink this Fellas," Barla said, raising the carved wooden cup to his lips. "Fellas? We had no Fellas." "We have it now, Dowell. Don't be so proud it hurts," Barla said, suspending pride in the interests of healing her husband. Thus abjured, Dowell swallowed the dose, closing his eyes at the pain even that minor movement caused his swollen flesh. Barla saw Aramina's tender concern. "The numbweed will be taking effect soon. I am truly grateful to this Mendy. I think a spoon in one of the sandstone bowls. A woman can never have too many of them," she sighed. "I am truly grateful to her, and—" She turned to Dowell, who'd closed his eyes in tacit accord. "I think that we must be grateful to you, daughter, in spite of the fact that you seem to have forgotten all we have tried to instill in you of manners and conduct." Aramina bowed her head, assuming a contrite pose. Then she realized that although her mother's voice was sharp, there was no bite to her words. Discipline required a scolding, but this time it was only the form that was obeyed, not the spirit. Aramina looked up and tried not to smile at this unexpected absolution. "Mina, if Lord Asganar. Dowell began in a voice no stronger than a whisper, speaking in short phrases between the shallow breaths he took. Favors us with his presence again. We must request formal permission to stay in this cave until I am able to continue our journey. I'll tell him, and I'll mention it to the guard as well. Dowell nodded again, closing his eyes, his mouth beginning to relax a little as Fellis and Numbweed gave him surcease. Barla rose and, motioning Aramina to follow her, left his side. "It is a good dry cave, Mina," she said, as if this were the first chance she had had to inspect it. "There are guards. We must not fail in hospitality. Hal remembered to offer, Mother, and they say they have their own rations." "That is not to the point, Mina, and you know it. Would there be more roots in the patch Nexa found yesterday, and nuts too? For they'd make a tasty flatbread." Aramina schooled her features not to betray her dismay, for it took a great many nuts to make a decent quantity of nut flour, and the grinding took hours. "I'll get nuts, and there may be some wild onions too," she said, aware of her narrow escape from punishment and determined to be dutiful today. "Where's Pell? He ought to accompany you." "He's with Kavan, Mother." Aramina picked up her sack, cleaned her belt knife, and sheathed it. She glanced about in the habit of someone used to thinking ahead on chores before she left. Pell was not with the guards, nor was Kavan, although Heth's bronze hide was visible through the trees. "The boys have gone off to set a wary snare," the older guard told Aramina with a grin for such youthful pastimes. "There's roosts there." He pointed over the rocky saddle leading to a farther dell. "A roast wary would be a real treat for all of us," Aramina said, smiling to include both guards. "Oh, aye, that it would, young lady." When Aramina started toward the nut plantation, he caught her by the arm. "It's you we're guarding. Where are you going?" "Only over that ridge," Aramina pointed to the south, "for nuts." "I'll just have a look-see." The guard strode along with her, past the sleeping Heth and up the long slope. He halted, catching her arm again, as he looked down into the peaceful grove. The nut trees, well grown, were so thick-branched that they had inhibited any undergrowth that the acid of the nut mast had not killed. The approach of humans had sent the wood snake scurrying, and only the last vestiges of the summer's insects flitted about. Nuts were visible in plenty. "I'll give you a hand," the guard said, seeing that it was a matter of scooping up the fallen tree fruits. With 2 willing pairs of hands, Aramina's sack was filled in short order. "How much do you need?" the man asked when Aramina began to make a carry-all of her jerkin. "Mother has a mind for nut bread." The man raised his eyes skyward. "It do be tasty, and you might just need enough," he winked broadly at her, "to stuff that wherry your brother plans to snare. I'll just fetch these to your mother. Don't stray now." Aramina didn't stray, but in gathering she headed toward the far edge of the grove, wondering what other edibles might be found. She filled her jerkin as she moved, and had it stuffed to overflowing when she reached the boundary. There the land fell away into broken boulders. She looked up to the top of the mountain on whose flank she stood. She could see down to a twist of the river rushing through a gorge, just visible through the wintry forest. To be alone after so many turns of overcrowding was a rare treat for Aramina. Maybe Lord Asganar's gratitude would indeed extend to a longer stay for her family in the cave. It could be made quite tenable, she was sure, even in the coldest weather. Or they could make stalls for nudge and shove, and if Lord Asganar didn't object, maybe cut steps up the bank. From the fallen trees they could fashion furniture. Her father could even season wood in the dry rear of the cave and have his own workshop. Her imagination embellished the dazzling possibilities. And then, being a practical girl, she sighed at her folly. She would be content enough to have a secure and private dwelling for as long as it took her father's chest to heal. She mustn't be greedy. She listened then, as the breeze caressed her face, to what other sounds might be carried up from the river. She wondered if the ambush had been sprung, and if she'd hear the sounds of battle. She shivered. Much as she feared Lady Holdless Tella and Giron, she wished only an end to their threat, not their lives. She heard the faint sound of someone treading close, and thinking it was the guard returning, was taken completely by surprise as a rough hand covered her mouth and strong ones pinned her arms to her sides. "It falls out well, after all, Giron," said a harsh voice, and Aramina's head was pulled cruelly back by her hair so that she looked up into the stained, sweaty face of Lady Holdless Tella. "We have snared the wild wary after all, and the trap she laid is bare for Asganar." Help me, Tella." Even if Giron's heavy hand had not covered her mouth, Aramina was completely paralyzed by fear. Her mind idiotically repeated the one syllable that meant rescue. "Heth! Giron growled at Aramina as he began to manhandle her across the grove. "Don't struggle, girl, or I'll knock you senseless. Maybe I ought to, Tella," he added, cocking his big fist in preparation. "If she can hear dragons, they can hear her." "She's never been near a weir." Tella's reply was contemptuous, but the notion, now Giron had planted it, gave her a moment's pause. Her face contorted with anger, she gave Aramina's hair another savage jerk. "Don't even think of calling for a dragon." Aramina couldn't have stopped her mind's chant, but she frantically rolled her eyes as if complying with Tella's order. Anything to relieve the pain of her scalp. "Too late!" Giron threw Aramina from him, a heave that left a hunk of her hair and scalp in Tella's hand, and Aramina teetering on the brink of a drop that was blocked by Heth. His eyes whirling red and orange in anger, he bellowed, sinuously weaving in among the trees, chasing Tella and Giron. From the other side of the grove came the two guards, Pell and Kavan, shouting imprecations. Aramina saw Giron and Tella disappear into the woods. The guards ran past in full pelt, but Heth had to stop at the edge of the grove, the forest being too dense for him to penetrate. He continued to bellow in fury, even after Kavan reached him. Shaking with reaction to her frightening experience, Aramina slumped against the nearest bulge-nut tree, clasping it for support and trying not to weep so childishly. "Mina, what happened to you?" Pell knelt beside her, his hand hovering over the bleeding scalp wound. "It was really Tella? Who else was with her?" Kavan was beside her, patting her shoulders. "You did the right thing, Mina. Heth heard you and told me. We were setting snares. Heth called for reinforcements. They won't get away. If there hadn't been so many trees, Heth would have caught 'em already." "Dragons," she said in gasps, "aren't built to run in forests." Sniffing, she pointed to Heth, who was retracing his way, weaving in and out of the trees, snarling as one wing caught on a protruding branch. He looked so funny. She oughtn't to laugh at the dear dragon who had saved her from Tella and Giron, but it was funny, and she began to giggle and then couldn't stop her laughing. "What's so funny?" demanded Pell, outraged by his sister's laughter. "I expect she's a bit hysterical. Not that I blame her. You take her other arm, Pell. We've got to get her back to the cave." "What about Heth?" Heth rejoined them, his roars now reduced to belly rumbles. "I told her I was coming. I told her I heard her. Didn't you hear me, Mina?" Heth curled his neck around Kavan to peer anxiously up at Aramina. Hiccuping somewhere between laughter and tears, Aramina speechlessly patted Heth's muzzle. I was so scared." Even her thought hiccuped. I couldn't even hear myself." "Shards," said Kavan, as a whoosh of wind signaled the arrival of a wing of dragons. Heth swiveled his head toward the display. "The guards chased them through the woods." As the three youngsters watched, Aramina marveling at the snippets of conversation she caught in the confusion of orders given and received, the dragons began to peel off from the wing formation, going in all directions in a search for the renegades. Tigellin's leading the wing, Kavan informed them, deftly picking out of the stream the information that escaped Aramina. "They'll search. We're to get back to the cave."
"Oh, my sackful of nuts!" cried Aramina.
"Nuts? She worries about at a time like this?" Pell was disgusted. Aramina started to cry again, unable to stop the tears.
"Mother needs them for bread flour."
"I'll come back for him," exclaimed Pell at the top of his voice in frustration. "I'll come back." Not completely reassured, since she knew her brother so well, Aramina was none the less willing to be helped back to the cave. Her mother, after her first startlement, bathed and salved Aramina's scalp and the other scratches she had received from the rough handling. If Barla did so with compressed lips and a decidedly pale face, she did not scold Aramina. Pell, under Kavan's stern eye, had gone back for the nuts and Aramina's jerkin. Kavan brewed more claw, a very welcome cup that infused Aramina's cold stomach with welcome heat. "Aramina, Lessa waits without," said Heth. "For your mother, too."
"Mother, we're wanted outside," Aramina said.
"By whom?"
"By Lessa, the weir-woman of Pern," said Kavan. "Heth just relayed the message." Barla looked at her daughter as if she had never really seen her clearly before.
"You don't just hear dragons," she said in a puzzled voice.
"They hear you, and they talk to you, and you can answer them."
"A very useful knack," Kavan said with a grin. Then he added,
"Lessa's waiting." "Is she angry with me?" Aramina asked timorously.
"Why would she be angry with you?" Kavan asked, puzzled. "We could not be angry with you, Aramina," said the most beautiful dragon voice that Aramina had yet heard. "Come on." Kavan took Aramina firmly by the arm to haul her out of the cave. "You don't keep Lessa waiting." Aramina's first impression of the slender figure standing in the clearing was surprise. The weir-woman of Bendon was so small in stature, a full head shorter than Aramina. But once Aramina confronted Lessa, the vivid eyes and the forceful personality made her forget about such a trivial detail as height. Nor had Heth mentioned that Falar and Lord Asganar also waited. "My dear child, are you quite all right?" Lessa's expression turned anxious as her hand hovered over the ugly bare patch on Aramina's head. "I don't know how that villain Tella eluded us," said Asganar, his teeth clenched with frustration. "We have captured the rest of her band. Fewer to trouble you and us. I am most chagrined, Aramina, that despite our precautions you were put at risk."
"I'm fine, really, Lord Asganar. Heth saved me, and Mother had the fellas and Numweed."
"We are extremely grateful to you," Barla put in, "for those generous gifts." "Generous?" Lessa made a scathing remark. "I would be a lot more generous, Lady Barla, if your stiff Ruatan pride would permit." Nothing could have startled Barla more, but though she permitted a slight smile to curve her lips, to Aramina she seemed to be more prideful than ever. "We Ruatans have reason to be proud, Lady Lessa, but not stupid in that pride, Lady Barla. Lytol tells me that Dowell's hold is still vacant, deserted, needing repairs, for no one under Fax's holding prospered. Would you prefer to return there? Lord Asganar," Asganar bowed at his name, "is also interested in anyone with wood-mastery." Barla looked from one to the other. "Ruata is ours by right." "So be it, Lady Barla," Lessa said, and from the way her mouth twitched, Aramina was certain that she applauded the answer. "However, Lord Asganar, I am certain that my husband would be glad to build you a gather wagon to acquit our lodging here." "Only if he also accepts the marks his craft allots for the labor," said Asganar with a wide grin. "Of course, Aramina is for Bendon Weir," Lessa went on, her eyes now fixed on Barla's face. "But I want to go home, to Ruata," cried Aramina, clinging to her mother now, clinging, too, to the dream on which she had been nourished from childhood, the return to the place of her birth, where her family belonged. "A girl who hears dragons belongs to the Weirs," said Barla, firmly taking Aramina's hands and pressing them hard. "It's not as if you can't visit any time you want to," Lessa said lightly. "I do, though we of Ruata serve our Weirs whenever we are called to." "Please, Mina," Heth's tremulous whisper invaded her conflicting thoughts. "Please, come to Bendon with me and Kavan. We'd love to have you." "You will be most welcome in Bendon Weir," said the dark, black, rich voice of Nementh. "There are eggs hardening on Bendon hatching ground right now," Lessa went on, her voice persuasive. "Bendon needs a girl who can hear dragons." "More than my family needs me?" asked Aramina perversely. "Far more, as you will discover," said Lessa, holding her hand out to Aramina. "Coming? I don't have a choice, do I?" But Aramina smiled. "Not when Lessa and Bendon's dragons have made up your mind for you," said Falar with a laugh. From the track, dragons bellowed in emphatic agreement.
A quiet one.
Have you never ridden a live horse?
I achieved the maximum level.
Have you ever ridden a live horse? The interviewing representative had repeated. Remembering her hours on the mechanical surrogate where she'd learned the basic equitational skills, Perry said,
I haven't had the opportunity.
Yes, quite. Well, I suppose that can't be helped. There will be a trial period, you realize. He kept scrolling through her file on the recessed screen, which she could not see.
Yes, I do.
Well, then, that's all now, young Perry. You'll receive notification of the decision in 2 weeks. The interviewer stood, gave her one of those formal little rictus smiles that interviewers seem to cultivate, and she had left with the sense that she had not quite won the last argument. But Perry felt that she had won another major battle in her long, private, quiet struggle to have the career of her choice. Modern parents, as well as modern educational systems, had, as their aim, fitted young people to rewarding, fulfilling careers in the widest variety of professions in a space-traveling society. Class trips constantly introduced students to possible career opportunities, taking them to aquaculture farms, space stations, laboratories, hydroponic installations. From the day that 10-year-old Perry had visited the working farm, her ambition had been to work with horses, whose very existence had recently been under threat. The others on the class trip had fussed and complained about the smells, the stinks, the stenches, but Perry had rapturously inhaled them, especially the lovely odor of the horses. She'd always liked watching them move in the training films or the oldie movies. They were so proud, so regal, so wild. Alone of her class, she had asked to touch a horse, which had responded to her tentative caresses with a soft nicker that had somehow thrilled her. The feel of the warm muscles under the skin, the bright and intelligent eye of the animal on her, its response to her tentative caress when it snuffed in her hand, its velvet nose nuzzling her palm, that had been the single most enthralling experience in her life. Through the ensuing years, that sudden fascination did not fade. Indeed, she accessed all the information about the equine species that the databanks in her linear residence complex possessed. She even found ancient books about horses, read all available discs by the currently acknowledged experts like T. King Sangster Mahmud III, and with avid eyes watched every tape of equestrian sports available. When Perry discovered that their residential exercise facility included simulated horseback riding,
She had asked permission from her mother to attend regularly. Perry, in her quiet way, simply hadn't mentioned that she had concentrated on one activity. The construct was subtly disappointing, like all things mechanical, although it performed as a living horse would. On it she had learned the basic equitational skills, had gone on to show jump on an advanced model. At least her instructor had recognized her enthusiasm and encouraged her to achieve the maximum skills available on the surrogate. But the simulations were just that, and she was constantly frustrated by the sense that she was ineluctably missing the most important facet. So, with her goal in mind, she had tailored all her courses, even her special assignments, toward the end of qualifying for the Idaho Preserve. In zoology, she had done an extensive survey into the propagation of breed animals. She had studied the stresses now attacking both equines and bovines, and was fully cognizant of the perilous future that needed no probability curve to trace. She had joined the lobby that wished to send specimens of the endangered species out to new worlds, where they could flourish and regain the strengths and numbers they had once enjoyed. When her acceptance to the Idaho Preserve had arrived, complete with hotel travel voucher, Perry was ecstatic. Her mother was horrified that her daughter had applied for a career in such a bizarre occupation. "What on earth made you choose animals?" her mother demanded, syllabifying the word to express her disgust. "You brought me up to think for myself, Mother," Perry said, hoping for a kinder farewell. "And I have done so. If you can be proud of my brother terraforming worlds, please be proud of me for breeding the animals meant to inhabit terraformed places." "But to do so without discussing it with me at all? And you're leaving today?" "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been a quiet, self-contained child." With that, her mother had left the room, not quite slamming the door. Perry resumed her task of emptying her cabinets and drawers, realizing that there was very little in them that would be useful in her new life. On the Idaho Preserve, where would she need the gauzes of social life? The platformed heels, the decorative face patches, the baubles and bangles, even the security belt. That might deter a grown man, but it would be useless riding a horse. Her few real treasures of book tapes, holograms of her family, and her comfortable riding gear were all that she packed. Her mother had left a note on the fax. "Do right. Do right." Her mother had a slogan for everything, but Perry sensed both the outrage and the disappointment in those crisp injunctions. The journey to the Idaho Preserve was not direct, since the nearest station was relatively unfrequented, and she had to change twice to feeder lines. She arrived at the preserve in full dark, annoyed at being deprived of her first view, said to be spectacular, of the natural mountains and valleys. The station was also small, dirty, and unoccupied. No one was there to meet her. The dispenser refused to supply a beverage, and the slots for sandwich or snack bar were empty. Disgusted, she blew away enough dust to settle herself on one of the hard benches, wooden, and ran through a meditation exercise. It wouldn't do to appear disgruntled in her first contact with her new life. "Yoo-hoo!" The loud call roused her from a light doze, and Perry shot upright, disoriented. "You the tenderfoot?" The tall man in dusty clothes, hat shading his face in the dimly lit station, hauled a scrap of, could it be real paper, from under his belt. "Perry shown Denver Keys. Man, that's a lot of name for a little thing like you." Stiffly, Perry rose, and discarding other reactions to his unexpected approach, smiled. "Perry's enough." She extended her hand and had it engulfed in a worn leather glove and a moment of vice-like grip. No one in polite society ever did more than press fingers. Her hand was numb. "Monty, that all your gear?" He pushed his hat back, and she saw that his face was seamed with lines, tanned a leathery brown, which made his very blue eyes startling. His slight grin somehow told her that she had surprised him. "Yes." Harry had never been particularly talkative, but her laconic answer surprised even her. "Wow, how about that?" Unexpectedly, he swooped the pack up and started for the door. "Come on, time's a-wastin'. Got a long drive." He stopped, one hand on the door. "You can ride a horse, can't you? Perry nodded, not trusting herself to words as the memory of that interview bobbed up. His expression was slightly skeptical, and she psyched herself up for that moment of truth. Last one couldn't. He sounded both amused and sour. Great on theory, lousy in practice. He went on through the door, and she followed into a night the like of which she had never seen. She stood for a moment, face turned up to the starry sky, inhaling the crisp, chill air, gasping as a breeze actually flowed across her face and body. She coughed. "Gotta take it easy, city girl." Monty's voice came out of the darkness, and suddenly lights came on, showing the aged ground effects machine. It was something out of a vehicular museum. A straight-sided rectangle with funny windows, great wheels all muddy, and flip-up side seats in the back half. There was even a spare wheel on the front of it, a long, narrow package tied to its roof rack, and not a horse in sight. Harry felt an intense deflation. So his question had been idle curiosity. "Come on, Perry. I don't have all night. Morning comes early in these parts, and we'll both be rising and shining with the others." She hiked herself awkwardly into the high seat and pulled the door shut. A slight shower of dust settled to her clothing, and she was halfway to brushing it off when she realized he was watching her out of the corner of his eye. She saw the seat harness and managed to secure it without too much fumbling. He already worked the foot pedals, and the vehicle jumped forward with a belch and a roar. Harry scrabbled for something to hang on to as the vehicle jolted them from side to side. Assuming that the ground effects machine was operating properly, since the driver seemed unconcerned with its antics, she realized that she must relax. When she felt secure enough among handhold, seatbelt, and braced feet, she looked out the dusty window, trying to pick out landmarks in the headlights. Dark shadows loomed, and things seemed to arch over the roadway, if you could call it that. All ruts and stones and untreated surface. It was quite the eeriest experience Perry had ever had. Suddenly, two huge orange orbs loomed out of the darkness, and the vehicle swerved violently away from them. "Damned critter," Monty muttered. "We'll have to do some fence riding, that's for sure." "You permit your animals out at night?" Perry was astounded. "You betcha. Now, don't tell me you're one of the bleeding hearts. Wrap 'em up in cotton wool and don't let 'em so much as sneeze or steal on their onios." "No, I am not a bleeding heart," Perry said firmly. "Animals thrive in their proper natural environment. It is mankind who has restricted them to artificial habitats, not always suitable for the species." "Lord-dee, those are mighty big words for a little girl." "I wish you would stop with such affectations, Monty, or whatever your name really is," Perry said in a caustic tone. "If you are employed by the Idaho Preserve, then you have to have received an education and training that allows you to deal with its complexity and problems. Don't patronize me." "Just a touch of local color. Most appreciated." This time his speech was uncolored by drawl and sloppy enunciation. He almost sounded contrite. She could think of nothing to say, so she continued to peer out the window, trying to identify the natural landscape they passed. Monty did something with what she now realized were antiquated gears, and the engine of the vehicle changed pitch to a deeper tone. The vehicle began to climb. The roadway was narrow, dirt and gravel, pitted with ruts and holes that caused the vehicle to bounce and sway. To her right there seemed to be nothing but black space. To her left, the slope of a mountain. "Rather a spectacular view by day," Monty said in an agreeable tone. "Unless you're agoraphobic." "I'm not." Harry wondered if the journey would ever end, for having gone up the side of the mountain they came down on the other, around a second and third. She was also incredibly relieved that she had not been required to make such a long trip her first time on a real horse. "Is there a reason the station is so far from your headquarters?" Perry asked. "It's not if we have the heli in service, but one of the vanes has crazed. I picked up the replacement from the cargo bay." He pumped a thumb toward the roof. "The primitive contributes to the sophisticated from time to time." He grinned at her and pointed to a bright tangle of lights some distance ahead of them. "We're nearly there." As they neared their destination, the orange of the main illumination surrounding the crippled heli also lit up some of the other buildings in the complex. Several were familiar to her from her reading. Large barns, feed stores, the stark rails and posts of pastures, and long, low buildings, some showing lighted windows. "I'll drop you off first," Monty said, as if conferring a favor. Perry did not take offense. If the preserve had only the one airborne vehicle, naturally its repair would take priority over a lowly recruit. But she was pleasantly surprised when the vehicle stopped at the door of what was obviously a row of individual accommodations. "We may work rough and hard, but you got your own pad and the chow's top quality," Monty said. "Get your sleep. You'll rise and shine with the rest of us in the morning." Perry unbuckled the safety harness and got out stiffly, grabbing her pack. Reaching across her vacated seat, Monty hauled the door shut, leaving her standing in the roadway coughing in the dust the tires churned up. She walked up the 3 steps onto the long covered porch and felt around for the door's thumb plate. She couldn't find one in the dark and was beginning to be irritated when she noticed a knob on the left-hand side of the door. With nothing to lose, she turned it and the door swung in. To her surprise, lights came up immediately. Compared to her family's quarters in Jerhatton, this was palatial. 2 big rooms, 3 by 4 meters each, separated by a small food dispensary and a sanitary unit. The first room was clearly a living space, complete with a communication center in one wall, and the second was for sleeping with all its amenities clearly displayed. No wall units here. The bed looked terribly inviting. Perry made short work of her necessary ablutions, removed her footgear, pulled up the covering, and laid herself down with a grateful sigh on the bed. In what seemed the shortest possible space of time, a klaxon startled her into full wakefulness. "Wakey, wakey, wakey! All hands ready at 06:30 at the barn!" The voice was inescapable, and shock had Perry stumbling out of the bed, pawing through her pack to find work clothing. An odd noise and appetizing odor made her inspect the food dispenser to discover a mug of dark brown liquid. The liquid was scaldingly hot and rather bitter, but she recognized and welcomed the caffeine jolt it contained. As she stepped out of her quarters, she was even more surprised to see only the faintest tinge of light in the eastern sky. Lights were on all over the complex, figures purposefully heading toward the biggest barn. The air chilled her through the light fabric of her shirt. Why had she not realized this place would not be element protected? Shivering, she took time to retrieve the only outer garment she possessed, and then ran for the warmth, slightly out of breath as she joined the others. "Okay, folks," said a big man, jumping to a crate, holding up his hands. "Monty says there's fencing down on the station road and there's buffaloes loose. Josh, take a team and check it out. Main job today is rounding up beef stock for the Centauri shipment. We'll work the north 200. Before the heli vein cracked, Barty spotted most of what we need in Crooked Canyon." A groan rippled through the 20 or so facing him. "Tam, Perry arrived last night, so she's yours. The others can meet the pretty little gal later. Right now, roll 'em." To Perry's shock, no one went into the barn for a horse. They moved to the right as lights came up over extensive parking racks for 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles, some with sidecars already loaded with fencing and other equipment. Helmets and goggles were donned, and the vehicles revved up, spoiling the air with exhaust fumes as the bikes, yes, the archaic name popped into Perry's mind, crisscrossed each other's paths with seeming disregard for safety before they split into 2 groups, one going down the right-hand road and the other straight across the grassy land that headed north. "I'm Tambor," a voice said beside her, and a hand, gloved as they all seemed to be on this preserve, was jutted at her. She took the hand, steeling herself for another vice-like grip, and gave as good as she received. Tambor was a wizened man, his face grooved with lines so that his age could not be determined. He wore the same worn work garb as the others, the broad-brimmed hat and the gloves. "You look a strong young'un," he said, appraising her with shrewd, if bloodshot eyes. "Let's see if you're worth your salt." Did everyone use ungrammatic speech, well sprinkled with archaic idioms? Considering the strong scientific background required by the preserve, she had not expected the vernacular to be so conspicuous. "You're lucky," he added, gesturing for her to accompany him to the barn. "We've only got 1 more parcel of mares to ship out. Just got this 1 lot left to be conditioned for their ride to Centauri. Cattle are put in cold sleep, but the hosses ride first class, with a little help from us." They entered the barn now by the inset door. Simultaneously, lights came up along the aisle, and the odor, long remembered, of horse and manure assailed Perry's olfactory senses. Then she stared, for her recollection of stabling facilities from textbooks did not match with those she now beheld. There were 15 very narrow straight stalls on either side of the main aisle, which was not more than a meter wide. She had assumed that the preserve would follow the traditional ways of stable management: big, loose boxes filled with straw, high ceilings, and wide corridors. In confusion, she turned to Tambor, who had been waiting for some reaction from her. "This is a conditioning barn, gal," he said. "So we gotta get these critters used to the shipboard facilities, hygiene, and exercise. This is where they learn how. Come on." He beckoned for her to follow him up a narrow steel ladder to an open control facility. There was one chair at the console and a stool, which he motioned for her to pull up beside him. Below, the horses were nickering. "They know what's up. Okay down there, gals? Time for your dance step." He initiated a program, and as Perry watched, astounded, jets of water sprayed over the rubber matting under the animals. Then, from the front of each stall, a bar began a slow passage to the aisle, pausing briefly as it touched the front hooves, which the horses dutifully lifted, just like a dance step, in fact. The bars continued sweeping toward the aisle, where flaps suddenly opened to receive both droppings and soiled water. The bars retracted, the horses politely lifting their feet over it. The flaps closed, and Perry could hear the faint rumbling of conveyor belts. On the ship, the muck is processed, moisture recycled, and the roughage compressed into cubes about so big. He encompassed the appropriate space between thumb and forefinger, and stored to introduce Terran bacteria into the new soil. We just compress it and use it as fertilizer in the spring. Now, he went on, as the nickering below became insistent, they get their reward. His gnarled fingers ran over the keys and initiated another rumbling, this time over the horses' heads. They looked up expectantly. Feed cascaded into mangers, and the horses began eating with stampings of pleasure and much shifting of their haunches. "Now, we gotta do the same in the sheep and goat house. Then, by the time we're finished, it'll be time for a snack for us. After that, we exercise 'em." "We do?" Perry caught her breath at the prospect of riding a real, live horse. She also began to psych herself up again to prove that her surrogate training would suffice. However, after she nearly gagged on the concentrated stench of goat and sheep in their conditioning barn, Tambor marched her back to the horse barn and up the steps, where he dialed for the snack of more hot coffee and hot muffins, which must have been freshly baked. No programmed bread stuff matched this light texture or enticing odor. "Now we exercise our beauties. Where do you think you're going, little gal?" Tambor demanded when she jumped to her feet. "We exercise them." And his gloved forefinger emphatically indicated the mares below, just where they stand. "Watch." He tapped out a sequence, folded his arms across his chest, and followed his own advice. To her amazement, each of the horses was beginning to move, first at a walk, then gradually into trot, and finally into the canter gait, all in place on the rubber floor mats, which were also treadmills. Perry sat down totally deflated. How naive of her to assume that horses would be exercised by humans. If fencing was done from bikes, and stock was rounded up by heli, why did anyone need to ride the poor beast just to conform to historical precedents? "Now, don't look so glum, little gal," Tambor said, reaching across to pat her hand. "This is special conditioning for this extra special shipment. The mares got to get used to this sort of carry-on until they finally get to the meadows of Centauri. We want them and the foals they carry to come through the long journey fit as a fiddle and rarin' to go. This lot is about ready to graduate. They done real good. They won't suffer from a long period of inactivity. They won't spook from the sounds of a spaceship or go bananas. If you'll notice, the halters give accurate readings of their vital signs." He pointed to the display on the monitor, which she'd been too stunned to notice. "Now, they got 20 minutes on the treadmill. Then," and he presented this option as a reward to her, "we go down and give each mare a lot of TLC. "TLC?"
Tender love and care. A lot of stroking, petting, make 'em much of them, and just generally make them feel pretty good. Horses like human contact. The grooms going along will do that 2-3 times a day to keep 'em jollied along. Machines don't do all the work that's necessary to keep a horse happy. Not by a long shot, they don't. That part of the morning routine Perry really did like, once she got over feeling sorry for the horses stuck in such cramped conditions. They had, as Tambor pointed out, enough space to lie down if the urge took them. Horses spend a lot of time on their feet. They don't really need to take the weight off them, but they all want a change of position now and again, and we've allowed for it. Mind you, we had to reject some of the bigger-boned mares. He chuckled. Can't have them casting themselves in outer space now, can we? Did your books tell you how to groom a horse? Tambor abruptly became more rustic. They did? Well, here's your kit. Give 'em a good grooming. You take one side of the barn and I'll take the other. Slap 'em on the rump and tell 'em you're coming. They like to hear voices. Dutifully, Perry slapped a rusty red rump. Nah, gal, not like that. These ain't fragile, shrinking violets. They's horses with thick hides that won't feel no fly tap. He demonstrated with a hearty whack, and the brown mare moved to one side. Perry slapped with more vigor, and now the chestnut took notice of her. But knowing how to groom a horse properly did not explain how tiring the process was. By the second side of the chestnut, Perry was panting with her exertions. By the fourth mare, she was dripping with sweat, and her shoulders, back, and ribs ached. Her strokes got slower and slower until she saw that she was 3 horses behind Tambor. I'll just lend you a hand this morning, being as how you knew at all this, he said, moving in beside the gray mare. She redoubled her efforts and finished 2 in the same time it took him to do 2. But by then she was exhausted. Just then the noon bell rang, and Tambor guided her to the quaintly named mess hall. There was a cuttingly cold wind sweeping down the mountains, and she hugged her arms around her. Just you, me, and Cookie today, Tambor said with obvious satisfaction as they burst into the big room, a huge fireplace throwing out additional warmth. Admin crew eat up at the main house noontimes. Stallion barn crew are busy up there today, and everyone else is out. Cookie knows what I like, so you're in for a treat, gal. Cookie was an incredibly thin, tall man with a hooked nose, which Perry thought in surprise anyone else in this world would have had modified, a wide smile, and a cheerful disposition. Stew and dumplings as ordered, Tam, old buddy, he said as they entered. Hi there, Perry, glad to meet you. Just belly up to the table and pitch in. Apple pie, too? Tambor asked, his expression like an expectant juvenile's. You got it. Then Cookie affected a solemn expression. Poor gal, having to eat what this here human disposal unit wants. The aroma is very appetizing, Perry remarked politely, determined not to judge the food by its color and lumpy texture. She could not recall ever having eaten stew and dumplings or anything that resembled this. Hey, gal, your hands is sure in a state, Cookie said, grabbing her right hand halfway to her mouth with her first forkful. Get over there and put 'em into that there box. Why don't you say something about them? Tambor, you ain't taking good care of the help. Lordy, I plumb forgot she'd need skinning. She didn't say a thing. That last was added in a tone of approval. Tambor dragged her off the bench and propelled her into the small treatment room off the kitchen facility. He flicked a switch as he entered, and then hauled Perry by her shirt sleeve to the familiar sight of an extremities treatment rectangle. He shoved her hands in, glaring at her so fiercely that she grinned, recognizing his look as paternal. She rotated her hands and felt the healing vibrations rejuvenating the abused tissue, smoothing away the blisters raised by the grooming tools. Your hands'll toughen, but you better get yourself some gloves right smart. Come to think of it, gal, you need a few more clothes. You ain't ever lived outside a weather-regulated facility, have you? When Perry sat down again to eat, the stew had cooled sufficiently, and even if the textures were unfamiliar to tongue and tooth, she found it delicious. The apple pie, and she had eaten fresh apples as a special treat from time to time, was an experience for her. She expressed her pleasure to Cookie, who beamed with fatuous pride. Tambor ate 2 more slices of pie before he left the table. He gestured for her to follow him to the appropriate slot that would cleanse their dishes. Evidently one did not take a long luncheon respite, but the meal had revived Perry. Tambor then took her to the commissary outlet just off the mess hall, where she was outfitted with real leather gloves. Nothing's better than real leather. And fleece-lined waist-length jacket. We grow our own, you know.
and a long weatherized coat with straps to secure her legs. We get all kinds of weather up here. You'll need this soon enough. That about takes care of your first week's wage, Tambour said as they left the commissary booth. Library, rec facilities, lounge, or down this hall. You can meander down there later. Now, we gotta get those animals tested, hoof, blood, and hide. They're serial tested until the day we lead 'em on board. End of side. While Perry was familiar with the necessary laboratory tests required for any animals to be shipped off planet, she found it odd to be working at this task with Tambour. When he was discussing the procedures and going over the results of blood, skin, saliva, feces, and urine tests with her, he seemed to slip into another personality entirely. Methodical, precise, and quite professional. He gave her a satisfied nod when she had finished her lab work. Then they went back to the conditioning barn for another session of mucking out and TLCing the mares. This time she asked Tambour for their names. Don't get too fond of these, gal. We spin 'em out in job lots. You could break your heart getting fond of one or another. But you said tender, loving care. Of the objective kind, gal. Be objective with this bunch. By the end of the day, when the fencing and roundup crews returned, she was so tired. It required an effort to respond to the pleasantries. She counted about 40 people seated at the rough tables in the mess hall, all dressed in utilitarian gear, with weathered faces and jaunty, self-confident attitudes. Her immediate neighbors asked her to join them in some of the recreational activities, but she was too tired to accept. First day's the roughest, the long-legged brunette Chelsea agreed. Especially if you're working with Tam. He's tough. Chelsea was correct on all counts. Tam was tough. He kept moving every minute and never mind if she had to run to keep up. She would or die trying. Her hands hardened. She grew to enjoy that early morning grooming as much for the olfactory gratification that had lured her into this in the first place. The unique fragrance of horse, the tactile sensations of warm flesh under her hands, her growing realization of the individual personalities of the various animals was the reward she had anticipated. And yet she became increasingly dissatisfied. Horses? Horses all around, and not a one for her to ride. The hands were sent here and there on the bikes and the big trucks on horseback to perform the necessary tasks of the preserve. She began to resent her very basic duties, and was mollified only by the fact that Tambour was treated with great respect by everyone, including the administrators. Not even that trio were called by any titles that she had ever heard in the relaxed and informal atmosphere that pervaded the preserve. Even the exercise facilities in her residential, where everyone worked to achieve the same goal of physical fitness, were not as casual. By the first week, Perry had had a chance to orient herself, calling up the preserve spread on the computer in her quarters and memorizing the various areas and the twists and turns of the access roads and track. The preserve extended over an impressive sector of mountain range and valleys, a bastion of the natural 300 square kilometers that were not quite squared, having to take into account the vagaries of mountain contours. She noticed where the base camps and forestry stations and the educational farm were located, separate from the headquarters so that ponderous tour helis did not disrupt the daily routine or disturb the animals from pasture. She was amazed that some 10,000 horses, cows, sheep, goats, and a small herd of buffalo were resident on the preserve, as well as other small animals and fowl, whose natural habitat was this mountainous area. The main base had once been a dude ranch, Tambour told her, where people would vacation in natural beauty and ride out on long treks. Her quarters had originally been one of the guest accommodations. The mess hall was original, and the barn by the corral as well as the paddock complex. The conditioning barns, the stallion quarters, lab, storage, and garage facilities, heli hangar, and the other smaller buildings had been added as need arose. She had been there 2 weeks when Monty borrowed her from Tam and started to teach her the fundamentals of bike riding, an experience she found wildly exhilarating and unnerving. Imagine a vehicle that was not voice-activated. Why, it could be dangerous with no single command safeguards for speed, direction, and braking.
Well, it's true hosses listen to you, and you tell 'em a lot with your tone of voice, Monty agreed. But all your experience is closer to mechanical things. Learn to ride this bucking bronco first. You can't do it much harm. She fell off the mechanical thing several times, stalling, forgetting to shift gears, forgetting to brake in time, although she caught on to steering easily enough. She scraped her elbows and the calves of her legs, but she finally managed to put the bike around the obstacle course behind the garage. Not bad, Monty said with faint praise, as she stripped off the protective helmet and mopped her sweaty face. Learn the tracks and roads now from the main map. You gotta be able to get anywhere on the spread in an emergency. She was borrowed frequently then, generally about the time she should have been having a brief respite from her work with Tambor. One day she took some tools to one base camp, another additional lab supplies to the men up at Crooked Canyon who were scoping this year's crop of calves. She fell off twice on the rough roads until she got the knack of watching the terrain ahead of her. She boxed herself when she got back, and so no one noticed her new bruises or scrapes. But her greatest desire, to ride a live horse, seemed as distant as ever. Whenever she could, she would spend a few moments, hanging over the corral rail, watching the mounts used by the teams. Monty's big Appy, with its spectacular blanket of cream and roan splotches. Chelsea's paint, Barty's dun, Pedro's dappled blue roan. It occurred to her that most of the hands had chosen the sport colors. There were 3 Palominos, 2 Pintos, a leopard spot, 3 grays, flea-specked, dappled in iron, 2 more roans, and the very elegant bright sorrel chestnut she'd seen Tambor on from time to time. Was there some kind of competition to choose the unusual from the breeding herd? They were certainly easily identifiable as they grazed. It was then she noticed that they moved among animals with the more traditional colors, bay, chestnut, brown, and one, so dark it was nearly black. She liked it best, for no reason she could have explained. "Does anyone ever ride these mares?" she asked Tambor as casually as she could when she had been 2 weeks at the preserve. She hoped the little quaver in her voice was not too obvious. "Yep, we break 'em all in case they'd be needed where they're going. Reckon we say hasta la vista to this lot tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" She couldn't suppress her surprised and regretful tone. "Told you not to get attached to the critters." Perry swallowed the lump in her throat, patting the neck of the bay mare she'd been grooming. "There'll be another set in here soon's they rig the stalls," he added. "Get used to it. This is what we're here to do, and do well." Somehow Tambor implied that she, too, had done well, and that eased the pang. "We'll just give 'em a bath this afternoon on account there won't be no water available for such nonsense on board." Then he snorted. "Not that they'd like it much, 'cause we gotta use debuggers, and that stuff stinks." It did. Halfway through washing 20 mares, Perry could no longer bear the stench and put on a filter mask. Tambor didn't say anything, but she felt she had lost his good opinion. She couldn't quite rid herself of the odor, even after a long shower and much lather. "Phew! Stink! Gall darn it, Tambor, you and Perry sit down at the far end," was the order from the other diners. "If that's the way you feel about it, we'll raise you one," Tambor said, and, with a broad wink for Perry to join him, they moved to the bar to eat their dinner. "We really do stink," Perry said as she settled herself with her back to the dining room. "I washed real good, and I can still smell myself." "Doesn't last long, but I gotta admit it is a powerful stench. But then it's efficient. Most colonies prefer to leave the parasites back here. Ever think of shipping out?" "You mean as a groom?" Perry glanced at him, but his expression gave no hint of any ulterior motive for the question. "Nah, as a settler. Pretty little gal like you'd do well out there." "If there were horses," she began tentatively. Tambor grinned at her. "You're sure gone on horseflesh, ain't you?" Perry nodded slowly, not able to confide the depth of that fascination to anyone, even to someone like Tambor, who had evidently spent his life with the creatures. The next day, while Perry did feel the wrench of watching animals she had cared for and grown fond of being shipped out, she was also fascinated by the process. The entire unit of stalls, complete with treadmill and cleansing bars, which would be reattached to appropriate outlets in the cargo hold of the spaceship, were slipped out on well-oiled runners into the maw of the transport. She,
Tambor, and the 3 handlers who would be traveling with the mares to their new world stood on the center aisle, ready to go to any animal that showed distress. But the mechanical noises had been part of the conditioning, and the transfer was so smoothly made that none of the horses demonstrated any strong reaction. "A nice healthy bunch, Tambor," the head groom said, passing over the consignment note for his signature. "You do yourself proud. This your new offsider?" Perry was given a broad grin. "This is Perry. Good little worker." Perry felt herself blush with pride at Tambor's unexpected praise. She had an errant urge to wave goodbye as the immense cargo heli lifted. She did watch it until it was out of sight over the foothills, and only then realized that Tambor had too. He gave a sigh, but she didn't hear exactly what he muttered under his breath. "You're on the main workforce tomorrow, Perry. Take the rest of the day off." Tambor strode quickly away, followed by her burble of thanks. His shoulders were slumped and his head down. He kicked a rock out of his way, and suddenly Perry realized that Tambor should listen to his own advice. Behind her was the empty shell of the conditioning barn, all cables and rollers, a strangely gutted organism. With aimless steps she wandered over to the pasture where stock were having a rest day. Her little Blackie was racing, head up and tail carried high with 2 bays. She'd never seen anyone riding the little black, but maybe it hadn't been broken yet. She'd heard enough now to know that horses were broken and backed at 4 or 5, depending on the need for them. Most of the animals used by the teams were mares expected to breed foals at some time in their lives. Sperm from stallions of all breeds had been preserved against need, and only if a colony required an entire horse was one bred. Working so closely with the stalled animals had given Perry confidence. Now, prompted by that still unsatisfied desire to ride a horse, she ducked in between the rails and walked down to the nearest group. They lifted their heads, eyeing her. Monty's big Appy softly nickered what she translated as a query. "No, you're not needed, Splodge," she replied, and moved on a zigzag course toward the black mare who was standing, hip-shot, head to tail, with one of the yearlings, each tail whisking flies from the other's head. "Easy there, gal," Perry said as she approached, holding one hand out, palm up. Sleepily the mare raised one eyelid. Perry moved closer, being careful to move toward her left side, as Tambor had instructed her, keeping away from the yearling and its quick hind feet. The mare was not in a stable, was not haltered to a ring, could move away the moment she suspected danger. "Hi there, gal," Perry continued, not realizing that she was falling into the prevalent drawl. "How are you doing? You're sure a pretty thing, all shiny black like satin, dusty satin." Curious, the mare stretched out her neck, nostrils flaring slightly as she made identification of Perry. Her nose whiskers tickled, and Perry took another cautious step forward. The yearling poked its head over the black's back to take notice of the intruder, but it also wasn't startled. "Hello there, little gal," Perry went on, close enough now to stroke the nose. Another slow step, and she was at the mare's side, one hand still under her nose, the other stroking her neck and down her shoulder. The mare whuffled into her hand, then abruptly raised her head and pulled her lips back from her teeth, shaking her muzzle in the air. "Don't tell me I still stink of disinfectant." The mare stamped, but drew back when Perry attempted to stroke her again. Suddenly her ears pricked up, her head went erect, and she stared off to the foothills. Faintly, Perry heard the distant sound of an airborne vehicle, and judiciously stepped away. While most of the horses on the preserve were well accustomed to such noises, they could all spook, and she'd be smart to retreat. By the time Perry reached the corral fence again, the aerial disturbance had passed off to the northwest. She stood for a long while watching the little mare move, noting her conformation, everything about her. Then she went back to her quarters. Maybe a good long soak would eradicate the last of the medicinal stink. One good thing about the preserve, there was no water rationing when artesian wells drew upon hidden reserves deep in the mountains. After some desultory lounging about after her long shower, Perry realized how busy she had been, healthily tired at night in a way that was never possible in the linear, no matter how hard one exercised or worked. She also didn't like doing nothing. In just 3 weeks she was attuned to the pulse of the preserve in a way she had never been to the residential rhythms. How odd. She could put this time to better use than napping, so she dressed and went up to the mess hall. Since she hadn't even had time to explore the research library, she went right to its shelves of tapes on the history of the preserve. She was in one corner when she heard the voices. Then a phrase stood out, and shamelessly she listened. "So far so good, but you know the percentage of failure, Steve." Tambor was speaking, but not in his drawl. "Wouldn't much matter if she failed the last test," she heard the other man say in a rueful tone. "She's good enough on the practical. Seems to fit in." There was a snort. "Who'd know? She doesn't say much, just sits there with those big eyes of hers watching. A real residential graduate." What's wrong with being quiet? That's better than those motor mouths you always complain about, all wind and no substance." "You said she does whatever she's asked, does it well, and no complaints. Not even when the bike pitched her off. Cookie saw her using the box, and from the reading it was a bad fall. Did the mayors like her?" Tambor laughed. "Yes, and she really liked working with them. All but wept to see 'em loaded." "Isn't that your usual criterion, Tambor King Sangster Mahmud?" asked the other man ironically. "I just wish she was a tad more outgoing. She's too self-contained. The quiet ones can surprise you." "Are you talking horses or humans, Tam?" End of Side 3. The two men moved off down the corridor, and Perry didn't hear Tam's response. She remained stock still, one hand on the spine of a tape, the hairs risen on the nape of her neck, and a sick sort of cold feeling in the pit of her stomach. There wasn't anyone else they could have been talking about but herself. Tambor had been testing her all along, and she hadn't realized it. A second shock jolted through her. Tambor King Sangster Mahmud? The tape she had been reaching for, one of the foundation tests, Adaptation Techniques for Equine Types on Colonial Worlds, had been compiled and taped by T. King Sangster Mahmud. She'd read every tape he'd produced before she got here. Drawl and all, that undistinguished man who had worked her butt off was the real boss of Idaho Preserve. She gulped. "But he did say I was a good little worker." She clutched at that praise as she crept back to her quarters. What was wrong with being quiet? If she had something to say, she said it, except not to ask if you could ride a horse. You were afraid to ask that, weren't you? Maybe if you had. She couldn't just suddenly talk a blue streak at dinner. That would have been too out of character. Especially in the vicinity of Steve or Tambor, that'd be a real giveaway. And this final test, what could it be? If she'd been tested all along and hadn't realized it, worry made her more silent than ever. She wished she could ask someone, but as she looked over those in the mess hall, she realized now that she'd had very little contact with anyone but Tambor. "That's a deep sigh for a little gal," Monty said, slipping into the seat beside her. She managed a genuine smile, frantically casting about her in her mind for something to add, for she couldn't just grin at him like a fool. "The mayors left today. I was sort of sorry to see the last of them." "Glutton for punishment, huh?" Monty grinned at her. "Conditioning's not my favorite chore, but we all got to do it. Didn't I see you out in the pasture?" "I had a half day," she said almost apologetically. "Splodge was friendly." "He likes pretty gals, too." Monty had a very winning smile. "Saw you with that black mare. Did you like her?" "I couldn't get near her," Perry said ruefully. "Do I still smell of debugger?" she asked him. "Nope, or I wouldn't be sitting this close to you." His grin got broader. "Say," and he cocked his head at her, "would you care to have a go at the big board?" "With you?" She was astonished. Monty was a formidable games player, the solo champion of the preserve. She had watched his lightning reflexes often enough and admired his strategy. But the game board was a popular evening occupation, and she hadn't wanted to put herself forward. Monty grinned, full of devilment. "Well, I don't rightly think you'd want to go agin me, but I've a bet on with Pedro and Chelsea, and you're the only partner they'll allow me." She exhaled with gusto. "I think they're rigging it." "Could be, but I've a notion you aren't as slack a player as you make out." "I'll do my best." "It's all anyone can ask of you." She didn't disappoint him, nor did she grin at the chagrin suffered by Pedro and Chelsea. "We demand a rematch," the two losers chanted. Late to start another one, Tambour spoke up, having joined the audience about the board and players. We've got some ponies to break tomorrow, and you all's gonna need your wits for sure. And I sure shootin' don't want no soreheads breaking bones on me, Monty added. Rematch tomorrow, then, Monty. Pedro eyed him with a stern eye. Sure. Right, Bart? And Monty gave Perry a friendly clout on the shoulder. Sure, she said, not at all certain. She lay awake far too late, worrying about the final test and her incurable taciturnity, hearing owl hoot until the rhythmic sound finally lulled her to sleep. There was a buzz of excitement the next morning in the mess hall, an excitement to which Perry, despite her fretting, was not immune. Not everyone was to take part in the breaking, so those assigned elsewhere shouted cheerful encouragements, and Perry heard wagers laid. There were evidently 4 in the breaking team, Monty, Pedro, the dark-haired Chelsea, and a lanky girl named Beth. You might as well come watch, too, Tambour told Perry, who hadn't been assigned to any duty. See how it's done. When she reached the smaller corral, Tambour gestured for her to take a seat on the rail as others were doing. But unlike them, she could think of no banter or jokes to exchange. She noticed a little black satin mare in the pen just beyond the corral, with 10 or 12 others that were milling about uneasily. Then Monty entered the pen, gracefully swinging his lariat loop over his head, and the animals began to canter about, whinnying in alarm. She thought he was aiming to catch a sturdy piebald, but instead, at the last moment, the little black mare seemed to run into the noose. "Change your mind, Monty?" someone yelled in a bantering tone. "She'll do as well," Tambour called. The black had other ideas and valiantly tried to run away from this sudden restriction, head down and bucking, but Monty had snubbed the rope on a post. With his quarry captured, the others were let into the next pen. "It's the old-fashioned way," Tambour said, appearing beside Perry, arms draped over the top rail. "She'll be a range horse. Doesn't have the quality for one of the advanced schooling saddle stock. Nice enough conformation. A shade too short in the back. A trifle more bone, but that's all to the good in these parts." Fascinated, Perry watched as Monty walked his hands up the rope to the rigidly straining mare. He stroked and talked to her, and gradually slack appeared in the rope. The mare was still tense, head held high, nostrils flaring, but Monty persisted, stroking, and then slapping her more casually, neck, shoulders, withers, rump, until she stood more easily. Before either Perry or the mare was aware of what he intended, he had a blindfold on her. Chelsea and Pedro approached with breaking tackle, and the little mare, trembling now, was saddled and a hackamore slipped over her head. Chelsea stood at her head, one hand on the blindfold. Pedro hovered on the same side, stroking the mare's shoulder. "At my word," Monty said, taking up the thick reins and springing lightly to her back, not quite putting his full weight in the saddle. The little mare tensed on her splayed legs. Perry held her breath. Then Monty sat down. "Let her rip!" Blindfold whipped off, Chelsea and Pedro sprang back, and the mare sprang up, all 4 feet off the ground. Head down between her knees, she bucked and twisted, turned and sunfished, trying to remove the weight on her back. Everyone along the corral was yelling, whistling, and shouting. Perry wasn't sure whether they were encouraging the mare or Monty, who kept kicking her forward. He looked far too big to ride that little mare, Perry thought. It just wasn't fair. "Nope, it isn't," Tambour said, and Perry was appalled that she had spoken out loud. "But he's a great hand at riding 'em out. She's spunky, but she's smart. See? She's had a chance to figure out that she can't buck him off. Now she'll start running." "I don't think so." Some perversity made Perry say this just as the mare planted her feet and came to a jarring halt, and refused to move despite Monty's heels and the shouts and yells from the onlookers. How'd you figure that one out?" Tambour asked. She grinned at him. "She's smart. Too smart to wear herself out running around in circles." Monty, with Chelsea at the mare's head, dismounted. She snorted, sweat straining her neck and flanks, but her legs remained stiff, propped like an immovable scaffolding. "Go on down there, Perry," Tambour said, and before she knew what he was about, he'd shoved her off the rail into the corral. "Go on! Monty's taking the buck out of her for you. Your turn now." Pedro was beside Perry, slapping a crash helmet on her head, propelling her inexorably to the mare, who was again blindfolded. Monty grabbed her by the leg and hoisted her toward the saddle. Reflex actions found her settling into the deepest part, finding the stirrups, responding to drills learned on inanimate surrogates. But there was a vast difference to the feel of the mare between her legs, the trembling under her buttocks, the acrid aroma of sweaty fear rising up to her nostrils, mixed with her own. "When you're ready, Perry." "Now's the time to put theory into practice," Monty said, his grin encouraging. Gulping, Perry managed a short nod of her head, and Chelsea whipped off the blindfold. The others stood back. "Easy, girl." "Easy now, girl," Perry said, her voice trembling as much as the mare. "Go on there," roared Pedro, and he must have swatted the mare with the rope end, for she barged forward with an incredible surge. This was totally unlike anything Perry had ever experienced, even when the surrogate had been programmed for random and violent movements. Perry's teeth jarred together, and she felt the jolt through her entire body. But those long hours of practice saved her as her thighs tightened and she leaned back against the forward motion of the bucking mare. Buck, buck, switch! The mare was determined to relieve her back of its burden. Rear! Unexpectedly, the black neck came up and cracked Perry painfully across her nose. She grabbed for mane, feeling her leg grip loosen in surprise at the shock. Grimly she clung, one hand on the rein, the other on the mane, struggling to regain her seat. But she was off balance, and the mare wasn't underneath her any more, but to one side of her, and she was falling. For a frantic moment, Perry was afraid she'd never be able to breathe again. That ground, for all the sand, had been very hard. Much harder than occasional tosses to the matting around the surrogate had ever been. She was aware of the sudden silence from the onlookers, a congregate bated breath, waiting for her reaction to the fall. She elbowed herself to a sitting position, smearing blood and dust across her face as she looked around for her recent mount. "Grab her, someone! Don't stand there eating flies!" She climbed to her feet, aware that her shoulder ached, her ribs, that her nose was leaking blood, and very much aware that this was her final test. She rubbed her bloody face on her sleeve as she strode purposefully across the little corral to where the mare was backing away from Pedro as fast as she could. Perry intercepted her circuit, jammed her foot in the stirrup, and hauled herself back up into the saddle before the mare or Pedro realized what she had done, before she herself realized what she had done. But no flesh and blood critter was going to get the better of her. Not when she had practiced and practiced and practiced. All that time and effort was not going to be wasted by one lucky buck of a range-bred Mustang. Settling herself as deep as she could, Perry grabbed the rein from Pedro's hands and dug both heels in the mare's heaving flanks. "Come on, you mangy, wall-eyed bangtail! Show me your worst! Kick her, Perry! Ride her, cowgirl! Yahoo! Keep her moving! Ride her out! Give her what for!" Advice came from all sides, and Perry, determined not to measure her length in the sand again in front of this audience, kept after the mare until she settled to a weary trot, her sides pumping with exertion, and finally reeled to a halt, head down. She got a rousing cheer from her audience, but wiping her face in her sleeve, Perry swiveled to face Tambor. "Well now, Tambor King Sangster Mahmud, it appears to me that it isn't only the hosses you rough break here. Do I pass muster now?" There were a few hoots and good-natured hollers at her question. From the corner of her eye she saw Monty grinning, sheer devilment in his eyes. Pedro had flung his hat to the ground in a sort of triumphant way. Chelsea was slapping her legs at her impudence. Obscurely encouraged by their demonstrations, Perry kept her eyes fixed on Tambor. He glanced around as if taking in the attitudes of the assembled. But Perry knew it was his verdict that mattered, that he'd been her examiner in all the skills she would need here at the preserve. She couldn't stand it if she were rejected. She'd never felt more alive than at this moment, with the heaving mare between her legs, sweat and blood trickling down her face, the hot sun above and the mountains around. She waited, aware that her breath was no less ragged than the mare's. "Well, Tam, do I?" She'd never been so bold before in her life, but this time it mattered too much to remain silently, obediently waiting. Deliberately he pushed the hat to the back of his head and slowly let a grin break over his weathered face. "I reckon you do at that. For all you're a quiet little gal, you're full of grit. I reckon we'd just better sign you on permanent." and Perry let fly with a wild yell that startled even the tired black mare.
"Did I say quiet?" Tam asked. "Now you put that mare up, and I don't want to find a single sweaty hair left on her hide. Didn't I learn you nothing in that barn?"
If Madam likes you.
"It's green for go, fellas,"
said the systems engineer, his bony face wreathed with a weary but satisfied expression. He leaned back in the chair, arching his spine until all heard a muted crack. McGonagall, the portmaster, winced and grinned comically at his assistant Sackerson, his shipmate Ella M., and Randall Cleam, who manned the suspect-glitched mainframe. "And?" McGonagall prompted.
"And what? You had a couple of sour chips, 5 worn circuits, a wonky board, and some faulty connections, according to my diagnostics. Nothing serious."
"Nothing serious? Nothing serious?" McGonagall echoed himself as he turned a stunned expression to the others. "But what caused the—" Sackerson began, but McGonagall cut him off with a sharp slice of his thick fist.
"Your basic system is jolly good," the Sys-Eng said, rising and stretching his arms over his head.
This time a crick in his neck went pop. He patted the console affectionately.
"Well designed. However, I upgraded your mainframe with a couple of new programs, an internal systems check, so this won't happen again. You know how cost-conscious the space station services are," he went on as he packed up his service kit. "And I installed new holographic software to help you guys dock faster."
"Docking isn't a problem," McGonagall said, disgruntled, but he signed the others not to pursue the matter. "Look, need any fresh tucker from our hydro garden?" he asked ingratiatingly as the Sys-Eng zipped himself into his space gear. "We've got some The Sys-Eng gave a scornful snort. "I got better than they issue you lot, and I don't have to share." He beckoned closer to McGonagall in a conspiratorial fashion. "The ghost I hear tells you guys got—" McGonagall leaned away from the man in denial. "Just a sour chip in the visualization program. You won't have trouble now." "A sour chip?" McGonagall's bass voice traveled incredulously up an octave to end on a despairing note. Sackerson crossed his fingers behind his back, and he noticed Rando making an odd warding gesture. Ella grunted her disgust with the Sys-Eng. "Hey, what's this?" The Sys-Eng had picked up his helmet, in which now reposed a yellow banana. "Hey, maybe you guys got something I haven't at that. Got any more where this came from?" McGonagall stifled a groan and shrugged again, spreading his hands and grinning. "Could be, but I'm hoping that this is the last one." "Yeah, well, ta very." And peeling the fruit, the Sys-Eng bit off a hunk, chewing with pleasure. "Hey, just ripe, too. Okay, I'm off. Check me out, will you, mate? I'm due at Wheel 4 in 2 days. Gotta burn it." McGonagall signaled for Sackerson to escort the specialist to his vehicle, moored at Dock 4, which was nearest the control module. "Anything we should know about the updates?" Sackerson asked as he followed the Sys-Eng down the corridor, his felt slippers making no noise on the plasrub flooring. "All I did was wipe the glitches and load the new programs. Same general format as the old," a wicked grin over his shoulder at Sackerson. "And exorcised your ghoulies and ghosties." He chuckled his amusement. "Fine. Thanks." Sackerson could not keep the sarcasm out of his voice as he paused at the control module. "Catch," the Sys-Eng added, flipping the empty banana skin at Sackerson. "Biodegradable, you know. This station needs all it can get." The portal closed on his healthy guffaw, and with Sackerson bereft of any suitable rejoinder. It had been ignominious enough to have had to call in a systems engineer to check the mainframe, in the unlikely case that recent developments were a systems malfunction. While all the stationers had examined their inexplicable problem among themselves at great length, no one was bass-acrid enough to let a whisper of it off 3, just like a Sys-Eng to know it all before he'd even docked. With a sigh, Assistant Portmaster Sackerson threw the skin at the nearest disposal hatch on his way back to the control center, wishing it were something else that apparently wasn't biodegradable. When Sackerson re-entered the control room, Ella was on console, completing the debarkation routines. The Suspense's flashy little FTL drifted down away from Space Station 3's wheel before ignition, and the flare vanished quickly in the twinkle of starblaze. Sackerson registered and appreciated the portmaster's sour expression. "Well?" McGonagall asked his spacemate. "Well," Ella replied with a shrug, giving the console one more tap. "Program sure ran smooth, but it always did. I just can't see how she could materialize, or whatever she does, in a mainframe built 100 years after she breathed her last. It doesn't compute. It also doesn't make any sense." She rose and gave the disconsolate McGonagall a hug and a kiss, winking over his shoulder at Sackerson. "Little enough to titillate folks stuck out in the void. Been kind of fun to have something to puzzle out." McGonagall gave her a wide-eyed look of dismay. "But if that wag-winged Suspense spreads this around—" "You're a good portmaster, sir, with a clean record," Sackerson said stoutly. "SS3's never had any F-ups, bleeds, crashes, or leaks. It's a good station and a good crew. Besides, we can always say it's just a new game." To relieve the boredom of off-duty leisure hours, space stations, wheels, and mining platforms were immensely creative, given their limited recreational facilities. There was an ongoing informal competition to invent new games, physical or mental. The good ones circulated. "That's it, Sackerson boy, you tell him," Ella said, grinning. "He won't believe me, and I've been his mate for yonks." She glanced at the chrono. "Your watch, Sackerson boy. Come on, Miggy. Rando says his new war starts at 2100, and I'm going to whip that war ace no matter how long it takes me." In self-defense and to keep from thinking about their apparition and her habits, Rando Cleem had started a long, drawn-out war, winning battle after battle no matter who was his opponent. "Us," McGonagall corrected her, letting himself be drawn out of the control room. "I figured out the tactics that had his forces retreating last watch." The panel slid shut over the rest. Sackerson grinned ruefully. He envied McGonagall for Ella. She was all that a fellow could want in a spacemate. Trouble was that when Sackerson had been assigned to Space Station 3 6 months ago, everyone was paired off, one way or another, with the exception of Siggy Tang, who was near retirement, and Eco Mesmet, who never left the spin chambers. Sackerson tried not to feel like odd man out, but his singleness was beginning to get to him. He took the console seat, for it was now time for the routine station status check. When Sackerson began to log the results in, he really did see an improvement in the speed at which the data was reported. Once the report was finished, Sackerson altered his password. Sysenges were supposed to be discreet, but no one liked to think that even the most closed-mouthed head in the galaxy had accessed personal data. There were 59 minutes before any further routine, no scheduled arrivals, and his relief was not due for another 2 hours. Rubbing his hands together, Sackerson ran a test check to familiarize himself with a new internal systems check. That activity soon palled because, despite his proficiency and a half-year's familiarity with SS3's mainframe, he could not discern the subtle minor alterations. He had his hand halfway to the switch to look-see what was happening to Rando's war in the staff leisure facility, but he wasn't really that interested. Rando always won. He had reactions like the station's cat and must have been sleeping on military history and strategy tapes. Great man, Rando, even if he did see ghosts. Girl ghosts. Pretty girl ghosts. Cuddly girl ghosts. Sackerson hadn't seen a manifestation, though he'd found a lot of cherries in his bunk space. Rando had pronounced her vivaciously attractive, which had annoyed his spacemate Cleona considerably. Sackerson liked a calmer, dignified type of girl, but not as phlegmatic as Synithia, the unflappable station medic. Tilda, who was Trev's mate, was aggressive and went in for Taekwondo, with an enthusiasm only Rando matched. Trev usually watched it. It didn't do, he'd told Sackerson privately, for two spacemates to get too physical with each other. Having watched Tilda spar, Sackerson decided that she could deck Trev any time she liked. It was shrewd of Trev to let her work steam off, though. In any event, while there were some very good-looking female persons on board, Not one had indicated they might prefer his company to that of their present attachment. A green flashing light on the visual pad caught his attention. Specify. Sackerson blinked. He didn't remember turning on the holography program, but the amber-lit pad was on. Specify what? Appearance. Some had said that the Carmen Miranda ghost had been generated by the holography circuits. The sysenge had put paid to that theory, but Sackerson gulped because he hadn't, to his knowledge, accessed the pad. Then he grinned. Well, he could check the new software out and have a bit of fun. He'd program the girl of his dreams and see what came up. He wouldn't mind a ghost of his own creation, preferably one that didn't leave bananas where a guy could slip on the mushy things. He entered in the spirit of the exercise so completely that the bells of change of watch sounded before he had quite finished the holograph. He just had time to name the file Chiquita, thinking of the sysenge's banana skin, before he filed it away under his new password. He grinned as Rando arrived, certain that would be one of the first things the war ace would also do. "Did you win, Rando?" "No contest," Rando replied, slipping into the chair Sackerson vacated. "How many does that make?" "Hell, I lost count, easily over the 1800 mark now," which was nearly as many as the station's previous war ace had achieved. "Have a quiet one," Sackerson said in traditional exit fashion. He had a light meal before going to his space, jetting himself clean before he netted down in his bunk. But sleep eluded him as his thoughts kept returning to the unfinished holograph. He had made her a shade too short. He'd have to bend awkwardly to kiss her. Much more comfortable to just bend his head slightly. And the shape of her face should be oval rather than round. He'd rather she had high cheekbones to give her face character, and a firmer jaw. The retroussé nose wouldn't fit the cheekbones. Make it delicate and longer, and a broad, higher brow. He'd got the hair just right, swinging in black waves to her shoulder blades. Sometimes she'd wear it up, the ends curling over the top of a headband. He'd seen some beautifully carved scrimshaws, plastic but stained and polished like old ivory. One would go great against black hair. The eyes proved the quandary. He vacillated between a medium green and a brilliant light blue. Then he compromised. One would be green, the other the blue. He'd had a station mate on Alpha 2 with a blue eye and a brown eye. She said it was a genetic trait. He hovered between a cheek dimple or a cleft in the chin. He'd seen a very beautiful pre-Silicon Age actress who'd had a fetching cleft. His mind made another tangent. Would a cinema search break the monotony of Rando winning wars? Or better still, song titles. "I'm Chiquita Banana and I'm here to say." Unbidden, the advertising jingle popped into his head. Old Rando wouldn't do well in that kind of game, now would he? All he ever read were strategy treatises, and he only watched ancient war movies. Of course, that was all there were. Having called up the silly tune, Sackerson found it hard to shake, and ended up having to go through his Serenity sequence to get to sleep. 1,812 wars is enough, Trev yelled, enunciating carefully. "That is all, Rando. Finito. The wars are over." "Yeah? And what are we going to do now?" "The skin you love to touch," Sackerson said, grimacing ludicrously and smoothing the back of his left hand with his fingers, blinking his eyes coyly. 18-hour one. Rando stared at Sackerson. "What's wrong with him?" Trev shrugged. "What's the reference?" Sackerson asked, snapping a finger at Rando. "A new game. Spot the product from the jingle." "A skin you love to touch?" Rando guffawed. Then he paused, rolling his eyes. Rando was a competitor. He hated to lose anything. "Okay. How much boning up time do we get?" "Anytime you're off shift," Sackerson replied, feeling generous. The brief scrolling he'd done in the history of advertising reassured him. Not even Rando's rat-trap mind could encompass all the variations of the centuries. Hell, most big companies change slogans 3 and 4 times a year. The Madison Space Platform was named for the industry that started on the famous avenue, in honor of all the catchphrases that had generated enthusiasm for the big step. "Warm-up game tomorrow, 1300 in the wardroom." By 1400 the next day, half the off-duty stationers were there, nearly 40 players, and Trev had programmed a tank to display the distinctive logos and watchwords. Sackerson got a buzz watching the enthusiasm of the players. In another day, it had become a fad to log in and out with some catchy slogan or whistled tune. A lot of people spoke to Sackerson in the aisles and corridors who had never noticed him before, and he was feeling pretty good with himself. Except that he still occupied single space. He keenly felt a woman need, and there was simply no match for him on SS3. Out of this sense of loneness, he called up the Chiquita program again and made the alterations he had considered that first night. She was real pretty, his Chiquita. Dark curls falling from the headband, a trim, tall figure in her station togs, and he extended his daydream beyond physical appearance. Chiquita had a quick mind and a temper. She was a medic, teacher, programmer, engineer, quartermaster. Yes, quartermaster would fit in with his goal of portmaster. Space required more and more stations as waypoints, beacons in the deep void, manned and ready to guide the merchantmen, cargo drones, and passenger cruisers, as well as shore leave for naval personnel. A good team complemented each other, like McGonagall and Ella, Cleona and Brando, and Tilda and Trev. Chiquita would have been asteroid belt born, comfortable with life on a space station, because too often the planet-born got to yearning for solid earth under their feet, or wind in their face, or some such foolishness. She'd maybe have done some solid-side time in university, so she had polish. A spacer should have experienced the alternatives, so he'd know what he wasn't missing. Sackerson hadn't minded 4 years' study on Alpha Ceti, but he'd been bloody damned glad to get posted to the Alpha 2 platform and on to Station 3, in spite of recent occurrences. The job was getting too much for the present quartermaster, old Siggy. On the one hand, everyone did their best to help the old guy. Hell, he was original personnel, but there came a time when you couldn't cover up, because it endangered the station. Sackerson turned back to the more pleasant pastime. He tried to imagine Chiquita's laugh. Some girls looked great and had laughs like squeezed plastic. And she'd have a real sparkle in her eyes, so you had a clue to her inner feelings. And she'd have them, too. Straight dealing, straight talking, so he wouldn't have to think up alternatives the way Trev did with his Tilda. He heard someone beyond the panel, and he fumbled across the keys to save Chiquita to his personal file before McGonagall entered to relieve him of duty. "No problems?" the portmaster asked him, looking at the main panel with raised eyebrows. "None, sir. None at all. Quiet watch. All status reports logged in quiet, too," Sackerson replied, staring the portmaster right in the eye to prove his innocence. Well, thought I saw a send flash. Personal correspondence has to go out in the public spurts, Sackerson." Sackerson now looked back at the terminal, but the only color showing was the green of stability and order. "I know that, sir. Have it quiet." McGonagall flashed him a quick look. "Is that a slogan, too?" "Up here, maybe," Sackerson replied with a grin. He left with unseeming haste and gave the matter no further thought, until it was sleep time and he had to slow himself down after a rousing game of slogan, which he had won on points. Rando wasn't the fastest eidetic on board, not by a long shot. In fact, it soon began to take all Sackerson's free time to keep ahead of Rando on the history tapes to air more and more esoteric slogans and score Rando down. "The world's finest bread. Silver cup. Let them eat cake. Not an advertising slogan. Disqualify. When it rains, it pours. What about never scratches? Good to the last drop. I'd walk a mile for a camel." "What's a camel?" "Nestle's makes the very best..." "What?" "Hey, does it have to be a product, Sackerson?" "It has to be a slogan." "Gotcha this time then," Trev chortled. "Only you can prevent forest fires." "Forest fires? That's prehistoric." "Yeah, but whose slogan was it?" "I got one. You'll wonder where the yellow went." "Not fair. You gotta give the whole slogan. Give us a break." "Call for Philip Morris." "Who he? You mean what's he?" "Keep it clean, gang. Keep it..."
was right. It didn't stop. Yakida.
In them with mining platform Tau 5 for 20 cases of prime gin. A grand change from Cookie's raw rum. A passenger liner bought Slogan for 3 carcasses of authentic earth beef meat, and the mess voted Sackerson free drinks for a week, which, since he didn't drink much anyhow, Sackerson thought was spurious, but he took it as being a gesture of goodwill. Of course, Chiquita wouldn't mind a drink or two, and she'd be very good at Slogan, nearly as quick as he was. 99 and 44 100% pure. It floats. Let's not mess up the station now, gang. Damn the torpedoes! Not applicable. Well, it became a war cry. War cries are not slogans. I don't see why not. A slogan's a slogan. It stands for something. What does damn the torpedoes stand for? Not surrendering when faced with invincible odds. Nuts to you, Randall shouted, finally getting a chance to play. The police vehicle hailed Space Station 3 while Sackerson was on duty, and protocol required that the portmaster be summoned for such official arrivals. The PV came from Alpha, priority mission, coded urgent. I don't know, the portmaster said, scrubbing his short-cropped gray hair. What's the priority, Captain? He asked the PV. Urgent personnel orders, Portmaster McGonagall. Just let us nose in. I've got the requisition and travel papers. Ship shape and Bristol fashion, highest priority. I'm putting them in the scan now. Here you've got some good gin aboard for a change. Commencing docking procedures, Captain, McGonagall replied stiffly. Sackerson, you have the con. Dock this, the pause said, sodding so-and-so, vehicle. I've got to tell Sigmund to hide some of the gin. The PVs had been known to drink a station dry, for hospitality decreed that the defenders of the void should have unlimited access to station consumables. He would know about the gin, the portmaster said with a rueful sigh. And what in hell is he bringing in? I don't remember requisitioning anything recently. Certainly nothing high priority that requires police escort. They might just have been first available space, sir, Sackerson said, busy with hands and eyes on the delicate task of matching the 3-dimensional speeds and shapes of a large space station and a very small, fast PV. Now, how the hell could this happen? McGonagall demanded, watching the printout on the scanner. His question was not rhetorical, but Sackerson could not spare a glance. You can ask and ask and ask for something essential, even critical, and you can't get them to shift ass below and send it up. I could have sworn I hadn't forwarded Siggy's transfer to control. And here I've got a replacement. McGonagall sounded totally mystified. Not a bad looker, either, McGonagall snickered. Makes a nice change from old Siggy. Time he retired anyhow. Ships locked in, Portmaster, Sackerson said, leaning back with a sigh. Big ships were a lot easier to dock. He glanced over at McGonagall's screen and nearly fell out of his chair. Yeah, pretty as a picture, McGonagall went on, oblivious to the consternation of his assistant. Perez E. Jones, Chiquita Maria Luisa Catarina, born 2088, mining base 2047, educated Centauri, specialty quartermaster. Not that much experience, for we only need someone who can remember to order what we need and where it's stored. Sackerson stared with panic-widened eyes at the ID scan. This had to be the weirdest coincidence in the galaxy. Granted that out of the trillions of physical possibilities, someone vaguely resembling his dream girl was theoretically possible, but the probability... Sackerson's mind momentarily refused to function. How? The mainframe had just been vetted. All the boards, the circuits, there hadn't been so much as a tangerine or a cherry appearing for a week. Nothing since the Syzenge's banana. I'll go down and greet her. Give Siggy the good news. He won't believe it either. Yeah, while I'm doing courtesy, you call Siggy and tell him to save some of the gin for his farewell blast. McGonagall left Sackerson to stare at the visual realization of his imagined perfect woman. After his watch, it took all Sackerson's courage to enter the wardroom. He could hear the laughter, the cheerful conversation, always stimulated by the arrival of new personnel. Everyone would be getting to know her, getting to know his Chiquita. Rando might horn in. He and Cleona had had that brawl over slogans. Sackerson resolutely entered the cabin. "Oh, you gotta avoid this guy, Chiquita," Rando exclaimed, seeing him first. "He's the weightless wit responsible for Slogan." As she turned to look at him, Sackerson's throat closed, and he couldn't even gargle a greeting. She was his holo. From the slight cleft in her chin to the way her hair was dressed, curling over a band, green eye, blue eye, and sparkling with a grin of real welcome on her sweetly curved lips. She held out a hand, and even her nails were as he had imagined. Long ovals, naturally pink. Dreamily he shook her hand, reminding himself to release it when he heard a titter. "I'm pleased to meet the man who invented Slogan," she said, her eyes sparkling candidly. How come he hadn't realized that her voice would be a clear alto? He slid into the free chair and grinned, hoping it didn't look as foolish as it felt, plastered from ear to ear because he couldn't speak, couldn't even stop grinning. "Slogan's all you hear about Station 3 these days," she went on, not dropping eye contact, although her left hand strayed briefly to her hair. "That makes a nice change," Sackerson managed to say, making his grin rueful. He knew from the tilted smile on her lips and the sparkle in her eyes that she had heard the ghost rumor. "Now," Rando said, breaking in, "war games are far more a test of intelligence and foresight." "Oh, war games," she said, dismissing them with a wave of her hand and further entrancing Sackerson. "I played every war game there is when I was growing up on the MP, and won." Deftly she depressed Rando's bid. "Now, Slogan stimulates the brain cells, not adrenaline." She wasn't coy, she wasn't arch, but the way she looked sideways at him made Sackerson's heart leap. "Say, didn't you dock the PV?" "I did." "You're smooth." "Watch it, Chiquita," Rando warned. "This guy's dangerous. He's single-spaced." Ignoring Rando's thinly veiled leer, Chiquita tilted her head up to Sackerson and just smiled. "You've overlout," Cleona told her mate, elbowing him playfully out of the way. "Say, Chiquita, how'd you snaffle a posting like 3? Chiquita lifted both hands and shrugged. "I don't really know. I didn't think I was very high on the short list. And then suddenly I was handed orders, shoved toward the PV as the first available vehicle coming this way." She flashed a charming smile around the wardroom. "But it's great to be in such good space." "Why waste space?" Sackerson demanded, winking at her. Even in the free and easy atmosphere of a space station, where personnel have little privacy and every new association is public knowledge, Sackerson did not rush Chiquita. She had indicated a preference for the way his mind worked, and more directly that she liked his physical appearance. He let her get settled into the routine and waited until the next day before he asked her to the hydroponic garden. She smiled softly and winked at him before turning back to her supply text. Like any space-bred girl, she knew perfectly well what generally happened in such facilities. "This is a splendid hydro," she said, and paused as the path took them to the banana palm. "Well, now," and she flushed delicately so that Sackerson knew she was aware of the slogan for her name. How very unusual." "That's tactful of you," Sackerson said before he realized that his words were tantamount to an admission of the truth of the scuttlebutt. "I think you're tactful, too," she replied, and stood right in front of him. It would have taken a much more restrained man than Sackerson to resist the urge to see if he only had to bend his head. So he did. Then, just after they had thoroughly kissed one another, easily, gracefully, with no stretching or straining, Sackerson distinctly heard a soft, smug, sung sound. "What's the matter?" Chiquita asked, sensing his distraction. "I could have sworn—" "No, it couldn't be. We're not to have secrets from each other." He could sense that he'd better think quickly or lose the best thing that had happened to him. Then it occurred to him that when it came time to tell her the truth, he'd have the logged-on holo program to prove it. Right now was not the appropriate moment for that. He answered the immediate question. "Part of a slogan, I guess." But Chiquita tilted her head, prompting him. "Something like, 'The lessons are free'?" Copyright 1994, Dub Audio, Incorporated. If you would like to receive a Dove Audio or Dove Kids catalog, please call 1-800-328-3683 or 1-800-328-DOVE.